Hearts and Horses, a Pride and Prejudice novella, written by Christy Capps, narrated by Stevie Zimmerman. Prologue. Elizabeth Bennet was 5 years old the first time she fell in love. His name was Jackson, a giant black plough horse whose great hooves thudded against the packed earth of the lane behind Longbourn's stables. One ride was all it took to win Elizabeth's heart. Astride, Jane wound her small hands in the coarse mane. Elizabeth clung to her older sister's waist, her cheek pressed against Jane's shoulder blade, while the horse's gait sent tremors through her entire body as they bounced down the dirt road. Wind caught her loose hair and sent it streaming behind her like a banner. The hedgerows blurred into ribbons of green on either side of the lane. The sky above seemed wider, bluer than it ever had from the ground. Elizabeth's heart soared, keeping rhythm with the steady hoofbeats. She tightened her grip on Jane and closed her eyes, feeling motion and freedom and joy. "Faster, Jane!" she called, her voice bright with laughter. "He will not go faster," replied 7-year-old Jane. Elizabeth could hear the smile in her voice. Elizabeth kicked her heels into the horse's side. "Faster! Faster! Faster!" The horse rounded the bend near the kitchen gardens, and Elizabeth opened her eyes to see Mr. Barton, Longbourn's steward, step into the middle of the lane. His face was red, his expression thunderous. "Whoa!" he shouted, seizing the horse's bridle with both hands. The animal stopped so abruptly that Elizabeth nearly tumbled over the top of Jane. Only her sister's quick hand, reaching to steady her, kept her in place. "What do you think you were doing?" Mr. Barton demanded. "We were only—" Elizabeth began. Mr. Barton cut her off with a gesture. "Jacob," he called over his shoulder. "Jacob, come here at once." The groom appeared from the stable yard, his cap in his hands, his expression neutral. Guilt twisted Elizabeth's stomach. They had waited until the groom was cleaning the back boxes, then climbed the fence Jackson leant against to settle themselves on his back. "Get them down," Mr. Barton ordered. "Young ladies, the stables are dangerous, and these animals are here to work, not to amuse children who ought to know better. You know your father's orders." Jacob lifted Jane down first, then reached up for Elizabeth. She slid into his arms, her face burning with indignation. The ground was hard and unyielding beneath her feet after the gentle sway of the horse. "My apologies, Miss Lizzie," Jacob muttered, so quietly that only she could hear. "I did not see you. It's not your fault," Elizabeth mumbled. But Mr. Barton shooed the sisters toward the house, his hands flapping, as though they were wayward poultry. Jane took Elizabeth's hand as they walked. Elizabeth fought the urge to burst into Papa's study and make him tell Mr. Barton to let them ride. She wanted to demand it, wanted to stamp her foot and insist it was unfair. But her beloved Aunt Gardiner's voice echoed in her head. "Young ladies do not create a disturbance, Lizzie." So she walked when she wanted to run, and remained silent when she wanted to shout. She blinked hard against the angry tears that burned behind her eyes. One escaped anyway, sliding down her cheek in hot disobedience as they crossed the threshold. Mr. Thomas Bennet sat behind his desk, his reading spectacles perched on his nose, a volume of Latin open before him. He did not look angry, which Elizabeth took as a good sign. Neither did he look pleased at the interruption. "Tears, Lizzie?" His brows rose. "Mr. Barton made us stop, Papa." She swiped the moisture from her cheeks. He set his book aside. "Ah, I could not imagine they were tears of regret for doing something you knew you should not." "I wanted to ride for ever so long," Elizabeth announced. "Jane only went along because I begged her." Her father's mouth twitched, though whether with amusement or disapproval, Elizabeth could not tell. "I see. And did you enjoy your ride?" "Oh, yes, Papa." The words spilled from her before Elizabeth could stop them. "It was everything wonderful. I felt as though I were flying. Could we have a horse of our own? Just one. Jane and I could share, and we would take such good care of it. We promise." "Lizzie." Her father's voice held a gentle warning. "The horses we keep at Longbourn are for the farm, our estate. They plough the fields and pull the carts and our carriage. We do not have horses for riding about the countryside." "But, Papa—" "There is no money for a riding horse," her father continued. "There are 5 of you girls to feed and clothe. Your mother has expenses, and I have my books. The horse is a luxury we cannot afford." Elizabeth tried diligently to temper her plea. "Could we not save for one? If Mamma—" "Elizabeth!" The firmness in his tone stopped her. "The answer is no. I am sorry, my dear. You must content yourselves with other amusements. Stay out of the stable and off the horses. I insist." Jane curtsied. "Yes, Papa." Their father's expression softened. "You are good girls. Now run along and keep out of Mr. Barton's vicinity for the rest of the day." Elizabeth could not stay away from the stables, or rather from the horses. The very next morning she crept out to the paddock where Jackson grazed, an apple hidden in her apron pocket. The old plough horse lifted his head at her approach, his dark eyes interested. Elizabeth's heart swelled. This she could do. Mr. Barton and her father had forbidden the stables and riding, nothing else. Over the weeks and months that followed, Elizabeth visited the horses whenever they stood in the fields. She brought treats smuggled from the kitchen. She stroked their necks and learned which spots each horse favoured for scratching. She studied their movements, their ears, the noises they made. She stood at the stable door countless times. When Mr. Barton caught her, he told her Papa, and she was forbidden again. She loved watching Jacob curry the horses. Her fingers itched to help, to run the combs over their shiny coats. Every gentleman who arrived at Longbourn endured her questions about his horse, its breed, its age, its temperament. Every man received her plea to teach her to ride. The answer was always the same. "No, miss, horses are too big and you are too small." Elizabeth believed the horses would never hurt her. She loved them, and surely that mattered. Year after year, the answer remained the same when Elizabeth asked for a riding horse. Her father explained that he had a gentleman's horse until Jane was born. When it died, they needed to economise, now that the nursery was filling, so there were no funds to replace it. Their mother needed new ribbons, new furnishings, and new gowns for assemblies. Their father needed the latest volume of poetry, the newest translation of Cicero, or a subscription to yet another literary journal. At 10, Jacob finally told her the truth her parents could not speak. "There was a little girl, miss, your Aunt Phillips's daughter, Margaret, though most called her Magpie for all her chattering." The groom's weathered face grew pained. "Sweet little thing, not yet 3. She was chasing a boar one morning and ran behind your father's gelding. Startled the beast. The hoof came down before anyone could react." Elizabeth's throat closed. She had no memory of a cousin named Margaret. "And Mrs. Phillips?" Jacob shook his head. "She and your mother were as close as sisters could be before that day. After, well, there were no more children. Maggie was their only chance." That same day, Mr. Bennet sold every riding horse, Jacob explained. What remained were patient draught animals, kept for work and nothing more. His daughters would never be taught to ride. The risk was unthinkable, the cost already too high. Elizabeth never asked again. How could she, knowing what her request would cost her father, what it had already cost the Phillips family? The yearning never left her. When a gentleman cantered past on the road, or when she stood at that threshold and breathed in the scent of hay, horse and leather, the longing twisted inside her like a living thing. Elizabeth Bennet refused to surrender entirely. She vowed that some day, somehow, she would ride again, if only she could find a way. Chapter 1, 1811, October. For 3 days, Elizabeth, now 20, had nursed Jane through fever and sore throat at the neighbouring estate of Netherfield. Miss Caroline Bingley, their hostess, offered barbed remarks about uninvited interlopers whenever Elizabeth ventured downstairs. Her brother, Mr. Charles Bingley, hovered with anxious kindness. Mr. Fitzwilliam Darcy, the wealthy, arrogant master of Pemberley in Derbyshire, maintained studied indifference. Needing to be away from rooms that smelled of illness and corridors that echoed with Miss Bingley's false solicitude, Elizabeth slipped outside, while the rest of the household lightly still slumbered. Her half-boots crunched softly on the gravel path that led toward the stables. The morning air at Netherfield Park was fresh and crisp. The stable yard lay quiet in the early morning, too early for much activity. Most of the horses remained inside, though one occupied the paddock, a chestnut mare with a coat that gleamed like polished copper in the early light. Elizabeth stopped at the fence, her hands curling around the top rail as the animal's muscles rippled. A beautiful mare, clean lines, elegant proportions. She moved with the confidence of a creature who knew her own worth, head high, tail swishing with each deliberate step. When a groom approached with a halter, the mare turned her head just enough to fix him with one dark eye, then tossed her mane and trotted to the far side of the enclosure. Elizabeth smiled. The mare reminded her of someone, though she could not quite say who.
She does not care to be approached until she is ready.
Elizabeth started, turning to find Mr. Darcy standing a few paces behind her. Dressed for riding, he wore a perfectly tailored dark coat, his boots polished to a mirror shine. His features remained unreadable as ever, though he watched the mare rather than Elizabeth. She ought to curtsy and retreat to the house. Instead, she said, "She has spirit."
"That is one word for it."
Mr. Darcy moved to stand beside her at the fence, his hands clasped behind him.
"Stubborn would be another. Wilful. Determined to have her own way in all things."
"She knows her own mind." Elizabeth chuckled, realizing he very well might be describing her. 16 hands, I would estimate. Perhaps 16-1. Mr. Darcy's head turned sharply toward her.
16-2, actually. You have a good eye. You know horses."
"I know of them," Elizabeth corrected.
"You do not ride?"
"No." The admission cost her more than she expected. "I do not ride."
"Why not?"
The question was direct, genuinely curious, rather than merely polite. Elizabeth hesitated. She could offer the excuse about money, the one her father had given her for years. However, Mr. Darcy's steady regard made her speak the truth instead. "When I was small, there was an accident. My young cousin was killed by my father's hunter." The words came out flat. "My father sold every riding horse he owned. What remained are the farm horses. Jane and I were forbidden to enter the stables or attempt to ride." Mr. Darcy was silent for a moment.
"And you have wanted to ride ever since?"
"The only time I've ever been on a horse was when I was 5.
"Once."
His voice held an emotion she could not identify.
"You have not ridden in
15 years. She forced herself to look away from the mare, back toward the house. "I should return to Jane. She will wake soon."
"Miss Elizabeth."
Mr. Darcy stopped her. When she turned to see his expression, it was still reserved, though it contained a measure of warmth.
"The mare is Lady of Pemberley, by King's ransom, out of Morningstar. My father intended to call her Lady. Instead, my sister named her Gracie when she was a foal. Her coat matched the hair on Georgiana's favourite doll of the same name."
Elizabeth startled at his unexpected confidence. "Your sister must have been quite young."
"She was 5. I was 15 and thought it a ridiculous name for such a fine animal."
He continued to watch the mare.
"Georgiana was insistent, and even then my father and I could not deny her."
His tone held a gentleness that Elizabeth had not heard before. It did not fit with the cold, proud man who had slighted her at the assembly, who had rarely spoken to her since her arrival at Netherfield, save for a few stiff courtesies.
"As the lead mare, the other horses defer to her. She knows her place, and expects everyone else to know theirs as well."
"A female confident of her rank," Elizabeth teased. "How unusual." His head turned sharply toward her, and she thought she had gone too far. But then his expression shifted, a hint of a smile crossing his features.
Indeed, though I suspect Gracie's understanding of her place and society's understanding of it are not quite the same thing.
The mare finally deigned to allow the groom to approach, though she made it clear through every muscle that she permitted it rather than submitted. Elizabeth watched the horse's every move. "You have your Gracie. We had Jackson, a black giant with an easy temper. When we were children, Jane and I climbed onto his back. That one ride was—" She was unsure how to explain what that single ride had meant to her.
"It was everything,"
Mr. Darcy said softly. Elizabeth turned at something in his tone. He no longer watched the animal. The understanding in his eyes, the recognition of what that single ride had meant, what 15 years of denial had cost her, made her gasp softly. She could not look away, nor did she want to. "Yes," she said, "everything." Gracie stamped impatiently, reminding them of her presence. The groom slipped the halter on and led the mare toward the stable, though her attention remained on the man standing next to Elizabeth. "I should return to Jane," Elizabeth said, though reluctant to leave. The conversation had been unanticipated. Mr. Darcy spoke to her without the cold superiority she had come to expect from him.
"Of course,"
Mr. Darcy said. He inclined his head slightly.
"Miss Bennet is fortunate to have so devoted a sister."
Elizabeth curtsied and turned toward the house, her mind whirling. She had abhorred him from the moment they met, and had steeled herself against any further interaction with him. Despite this, standing by the paddock, he had been different. Perhaps she had simply seen a part he kept hidden behind that unapproachable exterior. She shook her head as she climbed the steps to the side entrance. It did not matter. Mr. Darcy's good opinion meant nothing to her. The mare, lovely as she was not hers to admire. Still, as Elizabeth ascended to Jane's room, she could not quite banish the memory of his voice when he spoke of Gracie, or the bewildering gentleness in his eyes when he said,
"It was everything."
She paused outside Jane's door, one hand on the latch. Mr. Darcy had understood what that single ride as a young child had meant. How had he known? And why did it matter so much that he had? She slipped into Jane's room as quietly as she had left, before she could examine those questions too closely. Jane's breathing still laboured, though not as much as the day prior. Elizabeth moved to the window, intending to open it to let in some fresh air. Movement in the stable yard below drew her attention. Mr. Darcy stood beside Gracie, while the groom finished checking the saddle's girth. Even from this distance, Elizabeth saw the ease in which horse and master interacted. Mr. Darcy's hand moved along the mare's neck, his touch slow and deliberate. He bent to run his gloved fingers down each leg. The groom stepped back, and Mr. Darcy reached into his pocket. Gracie's nose pushed against his coat with unmistakable intent. Elizabeth could not hear the man's words from this distance, but she saw his smile, a genuine smile, unguarded, as he produced a small apple. Gracie snatched it from his palm with more enthusiasm than grace, and Mr. Darcy laughed. Elizabeth inhaled sharply. She had never imagined he could look so handsome. The severe lines of his face softened, and he looked almost boyish, delighted by his horse's eagerness. He swung into the saddle, settling himself before leaning forward to speak into Gracie's ear. Whatever he said made the mare's ears swivel toward him. Then he gathered the reins, his gloved hands light, without tugging. Gracie moved forward toward where the groom held the gate open, her response immediate but unhurried. Elizabeth noted the absence of harsh commands, how his heels signalled the mare's flanks. Mr. Darcy carried no whip. He treated the animal as a partner rather than a possession. They started sedately enough, but once through the gate, Gracie broke into a lope, her gait smooth and ground-covering. Mr. Darcy sat easily, moving with the horse rather than against her. When they were far enough from the house that decorum no longer mattered, Gracie transitioned into a canter, then stretched into a full gallop. Elizabeth leant closer to the window, her hand pressed against the glass. Horse and rider moved as one across the field, with a speed and grace that made her pulse quicken. Gracie's hooves barely touched the ground, her mane streaming behind. Mr. Darcy's figure bent low over her neck. She remembered the old plough horse's plodding trot, how she had thought they were flying. But this was truly soaring. What would it be like, Elizabeth wondered, to experience that power beneath her, that freedom, to challenge Mr. Darcy to a race and win? Behind her, Jane coughed, a wet, rattling sound that pulled Elizabeth's attention to the present.
"Lizzie, what do you see?"
Her sister's voice was hoarse. Elizabeth turned from the window, pushing the wistful images aside. "Blue sky and horses in the field," she said, moving to pour Jane a glass of water. "The weather looks to be another fine autumn day." Only in her dreams could she ride like that. Only in her dreams could she know what it meant to gallop, to race, to be truly alive. She helped Jane sit up to drink, and, determinedly, did not look toward the window. That evening at the Netherfield dining table, Mr. Bingley inquired after Jane's health. Elizabeth assured him that her sister had improved. "I'm certain Miss Bennet will be quite ready to return to Longbourn soon," Miss Bingley said, her smile icy. "Then you shall be free to return to your walks about the neighbourhood, Miss Eliza. I understand you are quite devoted to the exercise. An excellent walker, are you not?" Elizabeth opened her mouth to reply, but movement across the table attracted her notice. The hint of a smile played at the corners of Mr. Darcy's mouth. Their eyes locked for the briefest moment at Miss Bingley's error. Elizabeth lifted one shoulder with a faint shrug. Mr. Darcy returned his attention to his plate, but the slight smile remained. Elizabeth stared at him. He had actually listened when she spoke, and he remembered. "Miss Eliza?" Miss Bingley's voice cut through her thoughts. "You have not answered. Surely you must agree that walking is your preferred mode of transportation?" "I walk a great deal," Elizabeth said, dragging her gaze away from Mr. Darcy. "Whether it is my preference is another matter entirely." Mr. Hurst, the Bingleys' brother by marriage, grunted from his end of the table and reached for his wine-glass. Mrs. Hurst adjusted her napkin, paying no attention to the conversation. "How mysterious you make it sound," Miss Bingley said mockingly. "But then country habits are often difficult for those of us from town to comprehend."
"I beg to disagree, Miss Bingley," Mr. Darcy said. "I spend equal months in London and at Pemberley. Country habits are not difficult to understand. In London I have observed many ladies promenading in Hyde Park and Bond Street with great pleasure. When those same ladies are at Pemberley, they equally enjoy strolling through the gardens and footpaths, through the woods. Wherever we are, we each do as we must. There should be no reason for disdaining one and accepting the other."
Elizabeth's eyes flew to his face once more. He studied his wine-glass, turning it slowly between his fingers. She could have sworn that the last comment was meant for her ears alone. Miss Bingley, oblivious, continued to prattle about the superiority of carriages and the inconvenience of muddy hems. Elizabeth barely heard her. A smile tugged at Elizabeth's lips before she could stop it. She ducked her head, studying her plate. Mr. Darcy was proving to be a puzzle, one she curiously wanted to solve. Chapter 2. Elizabeth woke shortly after dawn, slipping from Jane's room while her sister slept peacefully. The house was silent, except for the ticking of the hall clock, as she descended the stairs and ventured out into the cool morning air. Her steps quickened as she approached the stable-yard. Anticipation rippled through her when she spotted Gracie already in the paddock. The mare stood with her head high, surveying her domain with queenly confidence.
"You have returned."
Elizabeth turned to find Mr. Darcy approaching from the direction of the stable, dressed for riding. But this time there was no surprise in his expression. He looked almost pleased. "I hope I'm not intruding," Elizabeth said.
"Not at all."
He came to stand beside her.
"I confess I wondered if you might come to see Gracie."
Heat crept into her cheeks. She quickly turned her attention to the horse. "I thought to bring her an apple, but I did not wish to presume."
Mr. Darcy nodded. "Many grooms have attempted to bribe her into cooperation."
"And failed?"
"Spectacularly. She takes their offerings, then remains stubborn about whatever task they wish her to perform."
Mr. Darcy's expression shifted, his smile warm, just as she had seen the day prior through Jane's window.
"She's not dangerous, mind you, only particular about who she allows close."
Elizabeth's heart fluttered, like a bird taking flight. She cleared her throat. "You learned to ride very young, I imagine?"
"My father had me atop a pony before I could walk,"
Mr. Darcy said, his gaze distant with memory.
"He believed a gentleman should be as comfortable in the saddle as in his study. My mother was an accomplished equestrian."
"Was she?" Elizabeth could not quite keep the wistfulness from her voice.
"Indeed. At Pemberley, when we had no guests, she rode astride."
He paused as if waiting for Elizabeth's shocked reaction. Elizabeth's eyes widened. "Truly?"
"My father encouraged it. There are streams to ford, and uneven bridleways to traverse. The hillsides and ravines are steep. Riding astride provides far more stability and control. Georgiana does the same, when she is at our estate."
His voice warmed with affection.
"Of course, even with a side saddle, my mother and her gelding could take most hedges and fences. She was fearless."
"She jumped," Elizabeth breathed. The very idea sent a thrill through her.
"She did."
"I confess that I watched you ride yesterday morning, from Jane's window." Elizabeth glanced at him, half expecting censure. "You and Gracie looked... Well, I have never seen anything move so fast. Racing across that field must be extraordinary." Mr. Darcy's expression gentled.
"It is."
"I would love to do the same some day," she admitted. "Though I know one must learn to walk before one can run. Likely it is the same with riding horses."
"Just the same."
Mr. Darcy seemed to deliberate before reaching a decision.
"Would you like to meet her properly?"
"Oh, yes." He stepped away from the fence and opened the gate, gesturing for Elizabeth to precede him into the paddock. Gracie's ears pricked forward as they approached, her dark eyes watchful, but not unfriendly.
"Hold your hand flat."
Mr. Darcy retrieved a small apple from his pocket and placed it on Elizabeth's palm.
"Like this. Keep your fingers together, so she cannot mistake them for treats."
Elizabeth removed her glove and extended her hand, hardly daring to breathe. Gracie took a step forward, then another, her nostrils flaring as she caught the scent of the fruit. Then her velvet lips brushed Elizabeth's palm, tickling as they lifted the apple. The simple pleasure of it filled Elizabeth with joy. She chuckled, then glanced toward the house. "Forgive me. It would not do for Miss Bingley to realise I'm here." Mr. Darcy's eyes gleamed with mischief.
"If our hostess knew you were here, she would do everything within her power to join us."
He stroked Gracie's neck.
"Though I believe Gracie would not care for the mistress of Netherfield Park first thing in the morning. As I said, she is particular about her company. I am as well."
Their eyes met, and Elizabeth experienced that frisson again, stronger, more insistent. She looked away, focusing on Gracie's velvet nose, and tried to credit that the awareness spreading through her meant nothing at all. "You were suggesting that Miss Bingley is merely tolerable?" Elizabeth asked without thought. Mr. Darcy's brow furrowed, as though puzzled by the question.
"I would not presume to judge my hostess so harshly. I simply meant that Gracie prefers peace in the mornings."
Elizabeth inhaled sharply. He does not recall his insult from the assembly, that I was barely tolerable. His words had made no impression on him, thoughtlessly delivered and forgotten, while she had nursed the wound for weeks. She could press the point, could remind him of his words, watch his expressions shift as he realised what he had said. But to what end? If she angered him or embarrassed him, he might withdraw entirely, retreating behind his forbidding exterior. And she would lose Gracie, these precious morning moments. Instead, Elizabeth stroked Gracie's neck and said, "Of course. I should return to Jane. She will wake soon." Mr. Darcy inclined his head.
"Please give my regards to your sister."
"I shall. Enjoy your ride, Mr. Darcy." She slipped through the gate and started toward the house, refusing to look back. Behind her she heard the murmur of Mr. Darcy's voice as he spoke to Gracie, then the creak of leather when he mounted. Elizabeth climbed the stairs to Jane's room, her emotions in turmoil. She should despise him for that slight, and hold on to her righteous indignation. But standing in the paddock with a horse between them, his face lit with genuine pleasure, it had become considerably more challenging to do so. Darcy urged Gracie into a trot as they left the stable-yard, acutely aware of the windows of Netherfield behind him. Was she watching again? He sat a little straighter in the saddle, then caught himself with a grimace. He gave Gracie her head when they reached the open field, letting her stretch into the gallop she craved. The wind against his face should have cleared his thoughts. Instead, they returned to Miss Elizabeth Bennet, and her keen observations with stubborn persistence. He genuinely felt sorry for her. Not having a horse to ride would take much of the pleasure from his life. The circumstances in which she was raised denied her a pleasure she clearly would have loved. It was not fair, though fairness had little to do with reality. His own sister had been born with every advantage: horses at her disposal, skilled instructors, the freedom to ride whenever she pleased. Yet Georgiana had come within a hair's breadth of losing it all for a man who saw her only as a source of income. Did she ever stop to think what marriage to Wickham would have cost? No elegant gowns, no presentation to the Queen, no comfortable warm bed to sleep in, or a horse of her own to ride, no self-respect, love or devotion. His hands tightened on the reins at the thought, and Gracie immediately responded, her stride shortening, her head coming up in question. Darcy eased his grip. The mare transitioned into her rhythm, but he could sense her wariness, her sensitivity to his tension.
"Easy, girl,"
he murmured, stroking her neck in apology. Even Miss Bingley, though not born to a gentleman, had her own horse. Certainly she possessed the latest riding habits. He had seen her parade through Netherfield's drawing-room in them more than once, the dark velvet tailored to perfection. Though, now that he considered it, he could not actually recall ever seeing her seated upon a horse. Strange, that. Likely Miss Elizabeth had no riding habit in her wardrobe. Why would she? Why did he care? Miss Elizabeth unsettled him in ways he could not quite articulate. On paper, they were entirely unsuited. She had no fortune, no connections, no claim to his world beyond the accident of geography that had brought her to Netherfield. Her prospects were limited to whatever local squire might overlook her lack of dowry. Yet when she had spoken of riding that plough-horse as a child, he had heard himself in her words, had seen in her expression the same longing he would feel if someone denied him Gracie. And this morning she had studied Gracie's movement with such hungry attention. She loved horses, not the shallow affection of those who treated them as conveniences. She loved them as he did, with her whole heart. The realization threatened his carefully maintained reserve. Darcy had the resources to satisfy her longing. The horse, the equipment, the skill, all of it was at his disposal. However, providing her the means to ride would create expectations he could not fulfill. Society would read intentions into the gesture. Would she? He would never attach the Darcy name to someone with uncles in trade, no dowry to speak of, a vulgar mother, and younger sisters who ran wild through Meryton without a thought for propriety or decorum. But Miss Elizabeth was... He sighed heavily. Lord, but her eyes drew him in. She sacrificed her own comfort to care for her sister, which meant tolerating Miss Bingley's thinly veiled disdain. Her wit was sharp and refreshing, a contrast to years of simpering debutantes who agreed with everything he said. And her eagerness when Gracie had taken that treat from her palm, the pure joy that had transformed her face. He delighted in it. He could admit that much to himself, at least. No, it was more than delight. If he were honest, and he prided himself on honesty, he wanted to see her expression again, wanted to be the cause of it. He knew better, yet... He pulled Gracie into a canter, then a trot, needing to slow his thoughts as much as his horse. His mind drifted to the assembly, to his first sight of Miss Elizabeth Bennet. How had he overlooked her? How had he dismissed her? The memory hit him like a physical blow. She is tolerable, but not handsome enough to tempt me. Good Lord. He had said that. Loud enough for her to hear, apparently, since she had stiffened beside the paddock when she mentioned the word tolerable. He was an idiot. He had been in a foul mood that evening, irritated by Bingley's insistence that he dance, by the gossip of his income bouncing from one matron to the next, and by the assumption that every unmarried woman in the room was angling for his attention. That was no excuse. He had insulted her, carelessly, cruelly, and she had borne the slight in silence, even standing beside him at the paddock to speak of horses and dreams and all the things she had been denied, while he, fool that he was, had not even remembered his own words. Gracie tossed her head as they approached the stable, and Darcy patted her neck absently. He needed to make amends. But how did one apologise for an insult one had not registered delivering? How did one explain that what he had said then bore no resemblance to what he saw when he looked at her now? He dismounted and handed Gracie's reins to a waiting groom, his thoughts as tangled as they had been when he set out. Miss Elizabeth Bennet was a complication he had not anticipated, and he had no idea what to do about it. Chapter 3. "Jane, you will never believe the horse I met," Elizabeth said, settling into the chair beside her sister's bed with her needlework. Jane's colour had improved considerably that morning, and though Mr. Jones still insisted she remain abed, her eyes were brighter, her breathing easier. She looked up with interest. "A horse? Mr. Darcy's mare. Her name is Gracie, and she is magnificent. Chestnut coat, perfect conformation, and the most spirited temperament you can imagine." Elizabeth Needle paused mid-stitch as she smiled at the memory. "Gracie? Lady of Pemberley, but his sister renamed her when she was just 5 years old, after her favourite doll." "How charming!" Then with a knowing look Jane said, "And Mr. Darcy told you this himself?" "He did." Elizabeth returned to her stitching, keeping her eyes on her work. "We spoke near the paddock yesterday morning, and again today." "2 mornings in a row?" Jane's tone remained neutral, though Elizabeth could hear the question in it. "That does not sound like the aloof gentleman we met at the assembly." Elizabeth's needle stilled. "Perhaps I am softening somewhat in my opinion of him." "Perhaps. Jane, you must not read too much into it." Elizabeth set down her needlework. "On every occasion I have been in his company since his arrival, at the assembly, Lucas Lodge, at dinner, in the drawing-room, during tea, he has been arrogant, distant. The 2 conversations near the stable could well have been an anomaly, a momentary lapse in his usual reserve. Or it might be that he is more comfortable speaking of horses than making polite conversation in a room full of people." Elizabeth considered this. Mr. Darcy had indeed been different at the stables, almost amiable. "I suppose that is possible." "And you enjoyed speaking with him?" "I enjoyed speaking about Gracie," Elizabeth corrected. "The horse is extraordinary, Jane. When Mr. Darcy rides her across the fields, they move as though they are one creature. I've never seen anything so beautiful." Jane smiled. "I shall never forget how you love riding behind me on old Jackson. Even at that plodding pace, you thought we were racing the wind." "We were racing the wind," Elizabeth said with mock seriousness. "And we would have won, too, if Mr. Barton had not stopped us." Jane brushed a wisp of hair from her cheek. "I do not believe you miss Mr. Barton's presence at Longbourn in the 5 years since he departed." "Never." Elizabeth grimaced. "As soon as I learned he had taken a new position closer to his family, I assumed I would have the freedom of the stables. Of course, I understood Papa's reluctance to allow us to ride, but I did not expect him to restrict me from having any contact with the animals. Who knew that Papa would remain contrary?" "It is a wonder we did not fall off and injure ourselves, is it not?" Jane chuckled. "Bareback, astride, with no reins." "And no skill." Elizabeth was transported to that summer morning, to the memory of Jane's steady presence before her, and the rhythm of hoofbeats beneath them. "I do love everything about horses. Their sounds, their breathing, their whicker when they greet you, the smell of hay and leather. Is that strange?" "Not at all." Jane's expression turned wistful. "I understand. Mr. Bingley keeps several horses, you know." "Ah, so that is why you like him so much. It has naught to do with his kind nature or handsome face. It is entirely about his stables." "Lizzie!" Jane's cheeks flushed pink, though she was smiling. "You are terrible." "Never," Elizabeth countered. "And you are evading the question. How many horses does Mr. Bingley have?" "I do not know the exact number," Jane said primly, "though he mentioned he enjoys riding and keeps a hunter for the season." "A hunter? How practical." Elizabeth picked up her needlework again, grinning. "I suppose if one must fall ill at a gentleman's estate, it might as well be one with an excellent stable." "Elizabeth Bennet, you make me sound positively mercenary." Her eyes sparkled with mischief. "Not mercenary. You are simply a woman of good sense, who appreciates the finer things in life." Elizabeth added soberly, "Though, in truth, Jane, Mr. Bingley seems genuinely concerned for your welfare. He asks after you every time I see him." "Does he?" Jane's voice was soft, hopeful. "He does, and his concern appears entirely sincere, unlike his sister's inquiries, which are more like attempts to determine when we shall finally leave." Jane sighed. "Miss Bingley has not been unkind to me." "Because you were ill, and no threat to her designs on Mr. Darcy." Elizabeth bit her tongue before she could say more. Jane did not need to hear about Miss Bingley's pointed remarks or open disdain. "You believe she has designs on him?" "I believe she would marry him within an hour if he asked. Which he will not, if his expression when she attempts to gain his attention is any indication." Elizabeth shook her head. "Never mind Miss Bingley. Tell me more about Mr. Bingley." During the next hour, the sisters spoke of gentlemen, horses, and rides they had never taken. Elizabeth dreamed aloud about what it might be like to gallop across an open field, with the sky above and freedom ahead. In her imagination, the horse she rode looked exactly like Gracie. Darcy sat at the writing desk in his borrowed chamber, a half-written letter before him. The solution struck him with such clarity that he wondered why he had not thought of it immediately. There was a horse in his possession that was born the year Darcy was 2. The gelding was dignified and steady, exactly what Miss Elizabeth needed for her first proper lessons. The animal had served both Darcy and Georgiana faithfully over the years. Darcy had ridden him exclusively after outgrowing his first pony, and later Georgiana was comfortable with him until she desired more than his measured pace. Now Atlas awaited transport from the London townhouse to Pemberley, where he would spend his remaining years in well-earned retirement. Why not let him serve one more purpose before that final journey? Darcy set down his pen. Once he set this plan in motion, he would cross a line he had told himself he would not. Darcy stared at the half-written letter. He did this because Atlas needed exercise, because it was practical, because he wanted Miss Elizabeth's face to light with joy again, because the memory of her laughter, quickly stifled behind her hand, had followed him through every tedious dinner conversation and every one of Miss Bingley's attempts to secure his attention. He had been considering this since yesterday's ride. No, if he were honest, since the moment mirth danced in her eyes. 2 mornings at the paddock were not enough. He needed to be honest. This had nothing to do with Atlas's needs, but his own. With determination, Darcy left the room to find his host. His friend was in the breakfast room, reading the newspaper with more enthusiasm than attention. His face brightened when Darcy entered.
"Darcy, just the man I wanted to see. Miss Elizabeth reports that Miss Bennet is improved this morning. Maybe she will be able to leave her room by tomorrow."
"That is encouraging news," Darcy said, and meant it. "Bingley, I have a favour to ask. My sister will need to visit within the week, along with our cousin, Colonel Fitzwilliam. I hope it will not be too great an imposition."
"Imposition? Not at all."
Bingley was already on his feet.
"I shall be delighted to see Miss Darcy again, and Richard, of course. I must tell Caroline immediately. She will want to prepare rooms."
Darcy suppressed a grimace. Miss Bingley would indeed want to prepare, though her preparations would likely involve elaborate dinners and attempts to impress. "They will not require any special accommodations. Simple comfort will suffice."
"Nonsense. Your sister deserves the best Netherfield can offer."
Bingley clapped him on the shoulder.
"They are welcome for as long as they desire."
"I suppose they shall remain for at least a fortnight."
"Then we shall make them most welcome."
As his friend hurried off to spread the news, Darcy returned to his chamber and took up his pen once more. "Richard, I need your assistance with a matter that requires both discretion and expediency. I would be grateful if you could escort Georgiana to Netherfield Park. Bring Atlas with you. Georgiana should pack for an extended stay. Her maid and horse should accompany her naturally. Instead of returning to town, we will travel to Pemberley for the winter. I shall explain all when you arrive. Suffice it to say, the journey will benefit both Atlas and a young lady who has long been denied an opportunity to learn to ride. Darcy." He sealed the letter and wrote a second, this one to his sister. "Dearest Georgiana, Richard will have told you about my request. I hope you will not mind the imposition of a stay at Netherfield. The company here is interesting, but I believe you will find one member of the party most agreeable. Miss Elizabeth Bennet reminds me of our mother. She has the same spirit, the same quick wit, though circumstances have denied her the advantages you enjoy. Atlas needs her, and she needs him. You will understand when you meet her. Your devoted brother, Fitzwilliam." He dispatched both letters by express, then leant back in his chair. The arrangements were set in motion. He had only to determine how to present the matter to Miss Elizabeth. As charity? No, she would refuse immediately, her pride wounded. As simple practicality? Atlas needed the exercise before his journey north, and someone to ride him. Yes, that might work. By late evening, a reply arrived from Richard.
"Darcy, your mysterious request has thoroughly intrigued both Georgie and me. She is already packing enough gowns for a season, convinced you have found her a new friend. I have promised her nothing, as you have told me nothing, but I expect a detailed explanation upon our arrival. We shall depart at dawn, travelling at a comfortable pace for Atlas, and should reach Netherfield before the day's end. Atlas sends his regards, or he would if horses could write. The old fellow seems pleased at the prospect of a journey. Your devoted cousin, and occasional errand boy, Richard."
Darcy smiled at Richard's irrepressible good humour, even in correspondence. The following morning, Darcy found Miss Elizabeth already at the paddock, her hands on the rail, watching Gracie in the early light. She turned at his approach, and he saw the familiar spark of pleasure in her eyes, before she schooled her features into something more reserved. "Good morning, Mr. Darcy."
"Miss Elizabeth?"
He moved to stand beside her.
"Has Miss Bennet improved?"
"I'm pleased to report that she had no fever throughout the night."
"That is good news indeed,"
Darcy said.
"I also have news that I hope will please you."
Her head tilted slightly, curious.
My sister and cousin should arrive by late afternoon. If I do not presume too much, might I introduce them to you?"
"Of course." The muscles around her mouth smoothed.
"So far, so good. I have sent for a horse from my London stable. His name is Atlas. He was my mount when I was younger, and later my sister's. He will need exercise before I transport him to Pemberley for retirement."
Darcy paused.
"I thought if you were willing, you might ride him while he is here."
Her breathing faltered. "Me? You would let me ride him?"
"Of course. He is an excellent horse for a novice."
Elizabeth's expression shifted through several emotions, too rapidly for Darcy to name them all. Hope, certainly. Excitement. Yet also what looked almost like fear.
"Miss Elizabeth, is something amiss?"
She shook her head quickly. No, I am simply—" Longing played across her features. Her throat worked, as though she were swallowing words. Darcy held his breath, suddenly uncertain whether she would accept or refuse. "I hardly know what to say. This is extraordinarily generous of you, sir. Do you mean it, truly?"
"I do. It is practical,"
he said, though even to his own ears the words sounded false.
"Do you agree?"
"Of course I agree." The words came out in a rush. "Thank you, truly." She looked up at him then, her eyes bright, and Darcy felt his heart constrict.
"You are most welcome," he said. "I shall introduce you properly when they arrive."
Darcy was reluctant to leave the paddock, to break whatever spell had developed between them. Elizabeth fled to Jane's room as soon as Mr. Darcy left for his ride, her mind spinning. A horse! He was bringing her a horse to ride. She paced the length of the room, while Jane watched from the bed, a knowing smile on her face. "Lizzie, you will wear a path in the carpet." "Jane, I have no riding habit." Elizabeth stopped mid-stride, touching her gown. "What am I to do? I cannot ride in this." She brushed at her skirt. "It would be entirely inappropriate. And his sister will be here. What if she is as proud as he was at the assembly? What if she looks down on me for my abilities? Good heavens, what if I fall off?" "Breathe, Lizzie." Elizabeth took a measured breath. "I want this with all my heart, Jane. I would tolerate any amount of condescension, any number of cutting remarks, if it meant I could sit on a horse again, even just to walk around the paddock." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "Do you think that makes me ridiculous?" Jane opened her mouth to respond, but Elizabeth continued, the words tumbling out. "I have not let myself want this in years, Jane, not truly. It hurt too much to hope for what could never be. And now—" Her voice broke. "Now Mr. Darcy offers it. And what if I love it even more than I did at 5 years old, and then it ends? Unless I marry a man who keeps horses, this might be my only opportunity to ride, Jane, my only one, and then it will be gone, and I will spend the rest of my life knowing exactly what I am missing." She sank into the chair, her hands twisted in her lap. "At least when I had nothing, I could lose nothing." "Oh, Lizzie," Jane said, "I think Mr. Darcy would not have made this offer unless he meant to follow through. And there is a possibility that Miss Bingley or Mrs. Hurst has a garment you might borrow." "I hope you are correct." Elizabeth stood and resumed her pacing. "I shall simply have to manage." Jane captured Elizabeth's hand as she passed the bed. "You will manage beautifully." Elizabeth squeezed her sister's hand, drawing strength from Jane's steady confidence. "I hope you are right." Chapter 4. Gardeners moved methodically through Netherfield's garden beds, snipping the tops from the spent blooms. Elizabeth's footsteps on the gravel path provided the only sound, save for the occasional cry of geese flying overhead in their neat V formation. Deep into autumn, the landscape held a stark beauty. Most leaves had abandoned the trees, leaving skeletal branches reaching toward the sky. Like the day Jacob drove Jane in the pony cart to Netherfield Park, clouds had been threatening, yet day after day the sun broke through. She gazed down the long drive, hoping to glimpse Atlas's arrival at Netherfield. The crunch of boots on gravel behind her made Elizabeth turn. Mr. Darcy approached at an easy stride, wearing an amicable expression that she was beginning to associate with their being away from the drawing-room. Elizabeth could not resist a smile. "You are on 2 legs, sir. No horse?"
"Guilty as charged. I have been known to ride from the house to the stables rather than lead a horse the distance. My cousin finds it endlessly amusing, though I have seen him do the same."
"A matter of mere yards?"
"Perhaps 50 at most."
His cheeks coloured with self-deprecation.
"In my defence, if one has a horse already saddled—"
Elizabeth grinned. "That is the reasoning of a true horseman, sir."
"Precisely,"
he said, his eyes warming at her understanding.
"I see you grasp the principle entirely."
They fell into step together, walking the gravel path without conscious decision. The ease between them felt natural, inevitable, so different from the stilted conversations from before. "Will you tell me about Atlas?" Elizabeth asked. "I confess I have been thinking of little else since this morning." Mr. Darcy's mien softened further.
"He is a Cleveland bay, tall, regal, with a rich coat and dark mane, tail and legs. His ears are tipped with black. He stands over 16 hands, with a proud bearing. In his youth he was the very image of a versatile, powerful horse."
"He sounds magnificent."
"He is. Was."
He seemed to search for words.
"Though age has slowed him, his spirit remains. He has always possessed a docile temperament, yet retained enough fire for riding. In town my sister would ride him through heavy traffic or noisy groups strolling through the parks, without fear that he would be startled."
Elizabeth could hear the affection in his voice, the same tenderness he showed when speaking of Gracie. "You mentioned that you learned to ride on him."
"I did, after outgrowing my pony. My cousin Richard, Colonel Fitzwilliam, is 2 years my senior. His father gave him a mare the same year my father gave me Atlas. Her name is Artemis."
"Goddess of the hunt."
"And she lives up to her namesake, lightning fast, fleet of foot, with a daring that matches Richard's own."
His pace had slowed as he spoke, his gaze distant, lost in memory. Elizabeth slowed with him, content to listen.
"We would ride together, at Pemberley or at Matlock, the Fitzwilliam estate. We raced, we jumped, we competed in everything."
A smile played on his lips.
"Artemis had speed, unmatched speed. Atlas had endurance, and a hatred of being beaten that bordered on stubbornness."
"They sound evenly matched."
"They were, which made every race a battle."
Mr. Darcy's smile brightened.
"One summer, I must have been 13, we were racing on a path that led toward Lambton, the small town 5 miles from Pemberley. We came around a narrow corner at a full gallop, and nearly ran headlong into a farmer with a lame horse, pulling a heavily laden cart."
Elizabeth drew in a breath. "Oh, no."
"We pulled up in time, thankfully. The poor man was taking his produce to market. The profits would sustain his family through winter."
"What did you do?"
"Richard's first instinct was to ride for help, but the farmer worried about reaching the market before the best stalls were taken."
Mr. Darcy shook his head, his expression rueful.
"I suggested we hitch one of our horses to the cart. Artemis would have none of it. She balked and made her opinion of cart pulling abundantly clear."
Elizabeth bit back a smile. "And Atlas?"
"Never complained. Not once."
Pride infused his voice.
"He pulled the cart the remaining 4 miles to Lambton without protest. We helped unload the produce, then directed the farmer's son to where he left the horse. Because Richard could not resist, and I will admit I could not either, we raced home."
"After pulling a loaded cart 4 miles?"
"Yes."
Mr. Darcy grinned boyishly.
"And we still won, by 3 lengths. He is a superior horse, Miss Elizabeth."
Happiness filled her, not just at the story, but how he told it. The vivacity in his features, the obvious love for both the horse and the memory. This was not the proud, severe man from the assembly. "Does your cousin still have Artemis?" she asked.
"When he was sent to the continent, Richard brought her to Pemberley, where she remains. She's retired now, kept in comfort."
Mr. Darcy added,
"Gracie is one of her foals."
Elizabeth's heart gave a peculiar squeeze at the poetry of it. Connection, legacy. That is... Elizabeth struggled to find words. "That is rather perfect."
"I thought you might think so,"
he said. "Do you have a breeding programme at Pemberley?"
"We do."
They walked on in companionable silence, while Elizabeth tried to steady the erratic beating of her heart. She studied his profile. "When you speak about your horses, you love them?"
"Absolutely."
She had expected him to deflect, perhaps to frame it in terms of duty or proper animal husbandry, so the immediacy of his answer surprised her.
"I trust them, trust their instincts, their judgment in ways I rarely trust people. A horse will tell you the truth of a situation, whether a path is safe, whether danger lurks ahead. They do not dissemble."
"And do they love you in return?" He offered a smile.
"I've been trying to convince Georgiana otherwise since she was small, to no avail. Animals are not like people, Miss Elizabeth. It is easy to ascribe human qualities to them. Love, loyalty, affection. In truth, they are simpler creatures than that."
"You do not think Gracie loves you?" asked Elizabeth, oddly disappointed by his pragmatism.
"Gracie knows that every time I ride her, she will be brushed afterwards, fed and rested in her comfortable clean box. She knows I will not misuse her or demand more than she can give. Is that love? Or is it simply trust built on consistent treatment?"
Elizabeth considered this. "Does the distinction matter?"
"To my sister, no. To me—"
He seemed to choose his words carefully.
"I prefer not to mistake a horse's nature for something it is not. Gracie does not lie awake at night pining for my company. She does not love me, but she trusts me, and that is worth far more."
Although she believed he must be correct, Elizabeth understood his sister's point of view better. "How do you earn that trust?"
"Consistency. Understanding."
Mr. Darcy's voice took on a new quality, as though he were already preparing to instruct her.
"Gracie dislikes the activity of the stable, the noise, the other horses, the grooms moving about. It creates tension in her. I can sense it the moment I mount, how her muscles flex and her attention scatters."
"What do you do?"
"I allow her to transition from distress to calm as we move away from the stables, to leave the turmoil behind until it is just the two of us. Only then does the pressure release. I can feel her muscles relax beneath me, the exact moment she settles."
His hands moved slightly as he spoke, as though the mare were beneath him even now.
"Only then do we run. To demand speed when she is tense would be to fight her nature. To wait, to allow her to find her calm first, that is partnership."
Awareness stirred inside Elizabeth, one that had little to do with horses, and everything to do with the man beside her. The care in his voice, the attention to what the horse needed, rather than what he wanted. It painted a picture entirely at odds with the proud, dismissive gentleman she thought she knew. "Although I have read every book I could find about horses, I know so little about riding," she said, "but I'm eager to learn."
Mr. Darcy's features warmed. "Then you shall. Atlas is the perfect teacher, and I—"
He hesitated, then met her eyes.
"I shall do my best to explain what he cannot tell you himself."
"Thank you, sir, truly." He inclined his head, and they walked on, while Elizabeth tried to hush the voice in her mind that hinted that she no longer thought only of horses. Darcy stood at the drawing-room window, his tea growing cold in his hand, as he stared out onto the drive. He should be anticipating Richard and Georgiana's arrival. Instead, his thoughts returned to the garden that afternoon, to Miss Elizabeth walking beside him, listening with such genuine interest as he spoke of horses and childhood races. He had wasted the opportunity. She had been a willing, engaged listener, and he had been so lost in the pleasure of her company that he had failed to address what mattered most, the insult he had delivered at the assembly.
Tolerable, but not handsome enough to tempt me.
The words haunted him now. He should have apologised, should have acknowledged his cruelty, instead of pretending it had never happened. Instead, he had talked about horses for half an hour, like a man with no better sense. What kind of gentleman offered a woman riding lessons, while leaving such a slight unaddressed between them?
A fool, that kind of gentleman.
Darcy's grip threatened his teacup. Setting it aside, he knew what he must do. He would apologise before the lessons began, before this went any further. He owed her that much. But would she accept it? At any moment the carriage should appear. Richard's note had promised arrival by late afternoon, since they would take the journey in slow stages for Atlas's sake. The sun was already sinking toward the horizon. Ominous clouds gathered. Early November in Hertfordshire meant rain, often for days at a stretch. If the weather turned foul, Miss Elizabeth's lessons would have to wait. The thought brought an unforeseen stab of disappointment. Not his own, but hers. He could too easily imagine her face if the weather turned, hope dimming to resignation.
"I trust Miss Bennet continues to improve,"
Bingley said from his position near the fire.
"Though not too quickly, of course. That is, I mean to say, she should be well enough to join us, naturally, but perhaps not so well that she must return to Longbourn immediately. Does that sound terribly selfish?"
"Terribly," Mrs. Hurst said, without looking up from her needlework.
"You are ridiculous, Charles," Miss Bingley added, her tone sharp. "Miss Bennet will leave when it suits her, regardless of your wishes. I am far more interested in Miss Darcy's arrival. Such an accomplished young lady. Her proficiency on the pianoforte is spoken of in the best circles. And her watercolours, I have heard they rival those of the masters."
Darcy suppressed a sigh. Georgiana's skills were considerable, yet Miss Bingley's fawning always felt less like genuine praise and more obsequious, as if to draw favourable comparisons to her own abilities.
"She is also remarkably well read," Miss Bingley continued. "Fluent in French and Italian, I understand, and so elegant, so refined. The product of the finest masters, of course. Not at all like these country—"
"Miss Darcy is a young lady still coming into her own," Darcy said, his voice cool. "I would ask that you not place undue expectations upon her."
Miss Bingley's smile faltered. "Of course, Mr. Darcy. I meant only to express my admiration."
Darcy returned his attention to the window, effectively ending the conversation. Miss Bingley's voice continued behind him, discussing the superiority of London masters to country instruction, but he stopped listening. Instead, his thoughts drifted to Miss Elizabeth. Would she be watching for the arrival as well? He gripped his hands together. Elizabeth stood at the window in Jane's chambers, her attention drawn to movement on the drive below. 2 riders raced hell for leather toward the house, their horses flinging divots of earth.
"Lizzie, what do you see?"
Jane's voice came from the bed, still hoarse but stronger than yesterday. "Riders, racing toward the house." Elizabeth leant closer to the glass. "I think, Jane, I believe it is Mr. Darcy's sister and his cousin." The rustle of bedclothes told her Jane was rising. In a breath, her sister joined her at the window, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. They watched in silence as the riders approached. The lady rode side-saddle, her dark riding habit flowing behind her, her posture confident and controlled, despite the precarious position. She pulled ahead of her companion by a length, then 2, her laughter carrying across the distance, even through the closed window.
"Oh, she is lovely,"
Jane said, her exhalation fogging the glass. They both hurriedly swiped at the condensation, not wanting to miss a moment. "And an excellent rider," Elizabeth added, unable to keep the admiration from her voice. "Look at her seat. Riding at that speed must take remarkable skill." The gentleman, Colonel Fitzwilliam, she assumed, grinned as he reined in, clearly conceding defeat. Miss Darcy's face flushed from exertion and victory. Darcy stepped out into the forecourt as the riders thundered into the courtyard, unable to suppress his smile at the sight of his sister, so free of the weight she had carried since Ramsgate. Georgiana reined in first, her face flushed with exertion and joy, her riding habits splattered with mud. "I won," she called to Richard, who chuckled as he dismounted. "You had a 2-length advantage at the start," Richard protested. "Hardly fair." "All is fair in racing, cousin. You taught me that yourself." "Georgiana, Richard, at last." Georgiana turned in her saddle, her smile widening. "Brother, we made excellent time. Richard said we could not possibly arrive before sunset, but I told him—" She stopped, seeming suddenly aware of her dishevelled state. "Oh, I suppose I should have arrived in the carriage." "You should have," Darcy said, though his tone held no censure. "Though I am pleased you do not." Before Darcy could help Georgiana to dismount, she had already slid to the ground with practised ease. Richard grinned broadly. "Your sister, Darcy, has become an absolute menace on horseback. I fear for my dignity." "Your dignity has been in question for years." Darcy embraced his sister and then tucked her arm in his. "Come, let us get you inside before you become ill. The weather looks to turn." "Is she here?" Georgiana asked. "Miss Elizabeth Bennet, the lady you wrote of?" "She is." "And shall I like her?" Darcy looked lovingly at his sister, hearing the anxiety beneath the question. Georgiana had so few friends, and trusted so few people after Wickham's betrayal. "I have no doubt." "Then I am glad we came." She squeezed his arm. "And brother, thank you, for bringing Atlas." As they entered the house, Darcy's first thought was to find Miss Elizabeth, to tell her they had arrived, that Atlas was here, and in the morning, if the rain held off, she could begin. The anticipation that coursed through him had everything to do with her happiness, and if that realization should have concerned him, he found he could not bring himself to care. Chapter 5. The sisters watched until the riders entered the house, and the animals were led to the stables. "She did not seem at all proud," Jane said. "She seemed rather lively." These first impressions of her are not like the impression her brother gave. Yet even as Elizabeth said it, she thought of the man in the garden that afternoon, speaking of Atlas and Artemis with such animation. Perhaps Miss Darcy resembled her brother, simply themselves when away from crowds and expectations. Jane coughed, a wet, rattling sound that snapped Elizabeth's attention from the window to her sister. "Back to bed with you," Elizabeth said firmly, guiding Jane across the room. "Though you are improved, you are not yet well." "I wanted to see," Jane protested, though she welcomed her sister's assistance in propping her body against the pillows. "And you did. Now rest." Once Jane was comfortable, Elizabeth returned to the window. Miss Darcy had been riding a grey thoroughbred, beautiful, sleek, young, which meant that the horse could not be Atlas. Elizabeth pressed closer to the glass, scanning the drive. In the distance came the slower procession, a carriage, and beside it a groom mounted on one horse while leading another. A bay. Even from this distance, Elizabeth could make out the rich reddish-brown coat and black points Mr. Darcy had described. The horse moved with a steady, ground-covering walk. Despite his age, he carried himself with dignity, neck arched and steps deliberate. Elizabeth's heart skipped. The groom and horses drew closer, and she could see more detail. He was tall, taller than she had imagined, with a handsomeness born not of youth or speed, but of character and presence. Her hand pressed against the glass, her heart doing that peculiar flutter she associated with riding. "Oh, you are magnificent." Atlas reached the courtyard below and stood still, his ears pricked forward with interest, taking in his new surroundings with what looked like curiosity rather than nervousness. Even standing still, he was beautiful. Elizabeth pressed her forehead against the cool glass and imagined the movement of that horse beneath her. If she could manage not to make a complete fool of herself, she would ride. A young lad led Atlas toward the stables, and Elizabeth realized that some dreams, no matter how long deferred, could still come true. Darcy stood near the fireplace in the drawing-room, poised to see when Elizabeth walked under the lintel. After changing from her mud-spattered habit, Georgiana sat on the sofa beside Miss Bingley, her posture perfect, her hands folded neatly in her lap, every inch the demure young lady their aunt, Lady Matlock, had trained her to be, a marked contrast to the happy girl who had raced Richard up the drive. Richard lounged in a chair near the window, perfectly at ease, despite Miss Bingley's constant chatter about his regiment, his postings, and his prospects. His cousin deflected each inquiry with practised charm, never quite answering, while appearing to be entirely forthcoming. To Georgiana, Miss Bingley said, "Miss Darcy, you must be fatigued from your journey, such a great distance from town, and in this weather. I do hope the roads were not too dreadful." "Not at all. The weather held, and my cousin is an excellent travelling companion." "So brave of you to ride the distance, rather than within the carriage." Miss Bingley's tone suggested the behaviour was not gallant at all. "Though I suppose country riding differs greatly from the more refined exercise one takes in town." Darcy's jaw set, but before he could respond, Richard spoke cheerfully. "My cousin rides like a cavalryman, Miss Bingley. Put her on her horse and she will outpace half of my regiment." "How impressive," Miss Bingley managed, clearly uncertain about his comment. Bingley, who had been hovering near the door, in apparent anticipation of Miss Bennet's arrival, finally surrendered to disappointment. "I believe I shall check on Miss Bennet myself, ensure she has everything she requires." "Charles, do not be ridiculous," Miss Bingley said sharply. "It would be entirely inappropriate for you to visit a young lady in her bedchamber." "Caroline is right, you know," Mrs. Hurst added. "I did not say her bedchamber, Caroline. I meant to inquire of the housekeeper. Mrs. Nicholls will inform us if anything is needed." Miss Bingley rose, clearly intending to prevent her brother from embarrassing himself further. "Come, Louisa, we will speak to Mrs. Nicholls and check on the arrangements for dinner." Mrs. Hurst rose without complaint. Mr. Hurst, who had been dozing in his chair, startled awake. "Dinner? Shall we go in?" "Not yet," his wife said. "Come, you have a spot on your cravat. You shall need to refresh yourself before we dine." Miss Bingley paused at the door. "Mr. Darcy, perhaps you and your family would care to rest before dinner? I am certain you would appreciate some privacy after your journey, Miss Darcy."
"We are quite comfortable here, thank you," Darcy said evenly.
Miss Bingley had no choice but to follow her sister from the room, her brother and Hurst trailing reluctantly behind. The moment the door closed, Richard smirked.
"Subtle as a cavalry charge, that one. I believe she hoped we would follow her." "Richard," Darcy said warningly, though he agreed with his cousin. "What? I'm simply observing." The door opened again, and Miss Elizabeth entered. Darcy's heart swelled. She had changed for dinner, though in a simple gown compared to Miss Bingley's elaborate silk. Her eyes swept the room, pausing on Georgiana with unmistakable interest, before finding his own. "Miss Elizabeth." Darcy moved forward. "Is your sister not joining us?"
"Unfortunately, no. Jane's cough worsened this afternoon, and she thought it best she remain in her room with a maid to attend her. She sends her regrets to your sister and cousin for missing their arrival."
"I am sorry to hear it," Darcy said.
Miss Elizabeth's gaze moved past him to Georgiana.
"Georgiana, Richard, this is Miss Elizabeth Bennet. Miss Elizabeth, my sister, Miss Georgiana Darcy, and my cousin, Colonel Richard Fitzwilliam."
Georgiana rose, her curtsy perfect, her smile shy but genuine. "Miss Elizabeth, my brother has written of you. I am pleased to make your acquaintance." Miss Elizabeth's eyebrows rose slightly before she returned the curtsy. "The pleasure is mine, Miss Darcy. I saw your arrival from the window. You are an excellent rider." Colour bloomed in Georgiana's cheeks, and her smile illuminated her face. "Thank you, though I confess the race was not entirely fair. I know Starlight far better than Richard knows his hired mount."
"If my horse were not getting reshod today, I would have won by a mile," Richard said, bowing. "Miss Elizabeth, a delight. Any friend of Darcy's is a friend of mine, though I should warn you he has been insufferably mysterious about why he summoned us to Hertfordshire with such urgency." "Cousin," Darcy warned. "What? I'm simply curious why my dear cousin required both his sister and an aged gelding delivered post-haste to—" "Richard!"
Miss Elizabeth blushed. "I confess, Colonel, Miss Darcy, the mystery is partly my doing. Your cousin has been extraordinarily generous in offering to teach me to ride." Georgiana's head snapped toward Darcy, her eyes wide. Then she peered at Miss Elizabeth. Darcy saw the exact moment his sister understood his purpose. "My brother wrote that you remind him of our mother." Miss Elizabeth's smile faded to surprise.
"Georgiana,"
Darcy said, wishing his sister had inherited even a fraction of Richard's ability to deflect and dissemble. Georgiana already moved toward Miss Elizabeth, her shyness forgotten. "He did. He mentioned that you loved horses, but had never had the opportunity to learn." She glanced at Darcy, her expression softer than he had seen it in months. "This is why you sent for Atlas. You will teach Miss Elizabeth as you did me."
"Yes,"
Darcy said, seeing no point in denying what his sister had already revealed.
"I will."
Miss Elizabeth's vulnerability made his breath catch. "That was kind of you, Mr. Darcy. Extraordinarily kind."
"Atlas requires exercise before his journey to Pemberley."
Richard made a sound that might have been a scoff. Darcy ignored him. "Of course," Miss Elizabeth said, but her eyes told him she knew better. Georgiana stepped closer, her earlier reserve completely abandoned. "I should love to help with your lessons, Miss Elizabeth, if you would permit. My father, brother, and Atlas were my teachers as well. They were endlessly patient and wonderfully forgiving of mistakes." "I would be grateful for any guidance," Miss Elizabeth said warmly. "Though I must warn you, I shall likely be the most hopeless student you have ever encountered." "Impossible," Georgiana said, leading Miss Elizabeth toward the sofa. "If you love horses, you will learn. The rest is merely practice." Richard moved to stand beside Darcy, keeping his voice low.
"She is not at all what I expected."
"What did you expect?" Darcy asked, unable to look away from where Georgiana and Miss Elizabeth sat on the sofa, already deep in conversation.
"A young child of about the age of 10 or 12, who ate, slept, and dreamed of horses."
Richard paused.
"When you wrote that she reminded you of Aunt Anne, I incorrectly assumed you meant her love of riding. But I see it now. Georgiana has taken to her. I have not seen her this comfortable with anyone since—" "I know."
"And you?" Richard's tone held knowing amusement.
"You were watching her as though she might disappear if you look away." "I'm doing no such thing. Cousin, I've known you your entire life. You've never brought Georgiana to meet a woman. You've certainly never summoned both of us to the wilds of anywhere so you could teach someone to ride."
Richard hesitated.
"What are you about?"
Darcy had been avoiding this question himself. When his sister's face lit with delight from something Miss Elizabeth said, he could no longer pretend he acted out of charity or the practicality of exercise for an aging horse.
"I have no idea."
Richard clapped him on the shoulder.
"Well, that is at least honest."
From the sofa, Georgiana called out, "Brother, Miss Elizabeth wishes to know if she might meet Atlas this evening. Would that be acceptable?" He turned his attention to her. The hope in her expression decided the issue.
"Of course, if she does not object to visiting the stables before dinner."
"Only if it would not be an imposition," Miss Elizabeth said, rising.
"No imposition at all."
Darcy moved toward the door.
"Georgiana, will you accompany us? And Richard, if you would provide propriety and witness your madness. Delighted, Richard said cheerfully. As they headed toward the stables, Georgiana walked between Miss Elizabeth and Richard, while chattering about Atlas's temperament. Darcy both anticipated and dreaded the moment Miss Elizabeth would meet the gentle beast that had carried so much of his own history. This was not about Atlas, or Georgiana, or even Miss Elizabeth's lack of opportunity. This was about making Elizabeth Bennet smile. Dangerous ground indeed. Chapter 6. After changing into half-boots and gathering her coat, they hurried to the stables. Miss Darcy kept up a steady stream of conversation, describing Atlas's favourite treats, warning her that he would nuzzle your pocket if he suspected you carried a treat. "He's quite shameless about it," Miss Darcy said. "No dignity whatsoever when food is involved." "Unlike Gracie, who maintains her queenly bearing even when begging," Mr. Darcy added. "Gracie does not beg," Colonel Fitzwilliam corrected. "She merely makes it clear that a tribute is expected and overdue." Elizabeth smiled, despite the nervous flutter in her stomach. The banter between the three of them spoke of deep affection. The stable yard lay peaceful in the fading light, most of the grooms having finished their evening duties. The scent of hay and horses and leather enveloped Elizabeth as they entered, familiar and achingly nostalgic. "Sam," Mr. Darcy called, "are you about?" A man emerged from one of the boxes, wiping his hands on a cloth. He was perhaps 50, with greying hair and the weathered face of someone who spent his life outdoors. His eyes were kind, his expression respectful but not servile. "Mr. Darcy, sir. Miss Darcy. Colonel." He nodded to each of them, then to Miss Elizabeth. "Sam, this is Miss Elizabeth Bennet. Miss Elizabeth, Sam has cared for Darcy horses since before I was born. He knows more about horseflesh than any other man in England." The groom's weathered face creased in a smile. "I do my best."
Miss Darcy said, "When I was too small for my legs to reach the stirrups, he would lead me around the paddock for hours."
"Happy to do it, Miss Darcy. You were a born rider even then." The groom turned to Mr. Darcy. "Atlas is in the loose box at the end, sir. He travelled well, with no signs of distress. Had a good rub-down and ate his supper. Seems content." "Excellent. Miss Elizabeth would like to meet him." The groom's expression shifted to one of approval. "Would she now? Well, Atlas will be pleased with the company. He's a social creature, that one. Never happier than when he's got people about." He gestured toward the far end of the stable. "This way, miss." They walked down the centre aisle, past horses whose curious heads appeared over the half-doors. Elizabeth recognised Gracie's copper coat, then the grey mare Miss Darcy had ridden. Starlight, she had called her. Each horse was beautiful and well cared for. Their boxes were clean and spacious. And at the end, in the largest box, stood Atlas. Elizabeth's eyes widened. She had seen him from the window, but that had not prepared her for the reality of standing before him. He was tall, even taller than she had thought, with that rich bay coat that seemed to glow in the lamplight. His black mane fell thick along his neck, and his dark eyes watched their approach with intelligent interest. "Atlas," Mr. Darcy said, moving to the door. "Come." The horse's ears pricked forward. He took a step toward the door, moving with a deliberate grace. When he reached his owner, he lowered his head, and Mr. Darcy's hand came up to stroke the broad forehead with obvious affection. "Good lad," he said in an undertone. "There is a lady here I want you to meet." Miss Darcy's hand found hers, squeezing gently. "Come closer." Elizabeth nodded, her excitement threatening to bubble over. Mr. Darcy stepped aside, making room at the door. Elizabeth approached, her heart hammering. She extended her hand. The horse studied her, his dark eyes calm and assessing. Then he stretched his neck forward, his nose coming close enough that Elizabeth felt his breath against her palm. His nostrils flared as he investigated her scent, soft velvet brushing against her skin. "Good evening, Atlas,"
I am Elizabeth, but you may know me as Lizzie, for I believe we will be the best of friends." The horse snuffled softly, as though in greeting. Elizabeth grinned. "He likes you," the groom said approvingly. "See how his ears are forward, how relaxed his eyes are. That's a horse at ease." "May I—" Elizabeth glanced at Mr. Darcy. "May I touch him?" "Of course." Darcy opened the box gate. "Come inside. He will not mind." Elizabeth stepped inside, acutely aware of the horse's size. Atlas watched her with curiosity, making no sudden movements. She reached up and laid her palm against his neck. His coat was sleek under her touch, the powerful muscles unmistakable. Elizabeth ran her hand along his neck, marvelling at the simple miracle of it. Soon she would be sitting on his back. "Oh," she breathed. "Oh, but you are wonderful." Atlas turned his head toward her, his large eyes gentle, and Elizabeth could have sworn he understood. Behind her she heard Miss Darcy's charmed laugh. "I knew you would love him. I told my brother that you would." Elizabeth could not look away from Atlas. She stroked his neck, his shoulder, learning every contour. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick. "This is—" Her voice broke. "I cannot find the words." "No words are necessary." Mr. Darcy stood close enough that Elizabeth could sense his presence at her shoulder. His tender expression surprised her, as though her happiness was his own. "He will take good care of you," Mr. Darcy continued. "I promise you that. Atlas has never failed anyone who trusted him." "I do trust him." Looking into the horse's calm eyes, Elizabeth knew it to be true. Miss Darcy asked, "Do you have a riding habit with you?" The words landed like cold water. Elizabeth's hand stilled on Atlas's neck. I'm afraid I do not." The admission burned with shame. "That is easily remedied," Miss Darcy said quickly. "I have several, Miss Elizabeth. We are nearly of a size. You must borrow one of mine." "I could not possibly. Please, I should be honoured if you would accept," Miss Darcy insisted. Elizabeth looked at Mr. Darcy, uncertain. His expression was encouraging. "My sister is quite right. Accept her offer, Miss Elizabeth. This would please her greatly." The Colonel spoke up from where he leant against a column. "And if you refuse, we shall all be subjected to Georgie's wounded feelings at dinner. I beg you, Miss Elizabeth, for all our sakes, accept the loan." His teasing tone broke the tension, and Elizabeth nodded. "Very well, if Miss Darcy is certain." "Absolutely," she said. "We shall go through my things this evening." "Then I accept. With gratitude." Elizabeth returned her attention to Atlas, stroking his neck once more. "Tomorrow we begin." Atlas stamped and snorted in response, making everyone laugh, and the last of Elizabeth's reservations crumbled. Elizabeth returned to Jane's room to find her sister resting against the pillows. A tray with the remains of a light supper sat on the side table, and Jane's colour improved. "Lizzie!" Jane set aside her book. "Tell me everything. What are they like?" Elizabeth sank into the chair beside the bed, unable to contain her smile. Her praise of Atlas, and even the groom, poured from her. Then she reported, "Miss Darcy is shy at first, but once she begins speaking of horses, all reserve disappears. She is enthusiastic and kind, with none of the pride I expected." She grinned. "The Colonel is charming, teasing. He has an ease about him that puts everyone in their best humour. I think you would like him very much." Elizabeth's smile widened. "He treats Mr. Darcy abominably, mocks him quite openly, and Mr. Darcy bears it with remarkable aplomb." "They are close, then?" "Like brothers, I think. There is real affection there." Elizabeth looked down at her hands. "Miss Darcy insisted I borrow a riding habit. Her maid spent the last hour adjusting it to fit me. May I see it?" Elizabeth retrieved the habit from where it hung on the wardrobe door in the adjoining chambers and brought it to the bed. The fabric, A deep, rich blue was far finer than any garment in Elizabeth's wardrobe. The tailoring was exquisite, with jet buttons running down the front, and a matching hat with a jaunty feather. Jane reached out to touch the fabric. "Oh, Lizzie, it is very fine. Far too elegant for a beginner. However, Miss Darcy would not hear of it. She said if I am to learn properly, I should look the part." Elizabeth held the habit against her length. "I will look rather like an impostor." "You will look magnificent." Jane's expression turned knowing. "Though I suspect you are thinking less of the habit and more of the gentleman who arranged for all this to be brought to Netherfield Park." Colour rose up Elizabeth's neck. "I do not know what you mean." "Lizzie." Jane's tone was gentle but firm. "You have spoken of Miss Darcy and Colonel Fitzwilliam, of the groom and the stable and Atlas. You have not mentioned Mr. Darcy, except as an aside. That is not like you." Elizabeth replaced the habit in the wardrobe, lingering over the task. When she returned to Jane, her sister watched her with curiosity. "He was different today. The man who stood beside me in Atlas's box, who spoke so gently to his horse, who watched me with such—" She struggled for the word. "Such kindness. He is not the man I thought he was." "Perhaps he was always that man. Maybe you simply could not see it before." Elizabeth sank into her chair. "I'm beginning to think I misjudged him, Jane. Not entirely. His insult was frank. His pride at the assembly was unaffected. However, there is more to him than I allowed myself to see." "And now?" Elizabeth thought of Mr. Darcy's face when she first touched Atlas. The care he had taken to welcome her rather than treat her as foolish. How he had sent for his sister, his cousin, and a 25-year-old horse, simply because Elizabeth had once mentioned riding a plough horse as a child. "I admire him," she said. "Against all expectation, and certainly against my will, I am discovering that Mr. Darcy is a man of honour. He is... Jane's smile was equal parts knowing and sympathetic. "Oh, Lizzie." "I know." Elizabeth pressed her hands to her warm cheeks. "It is ridiculous. I've known him for mere weeks. I detested him from the beginning. And yet he brought you a horse." Elizabeth's voice caught. "He moved heaven and earth to give me my heart's desire." "That is no small thing." Elizabeth agreed. "No small thing at all." They sat in companionable silence, Jane's knowing smile and Elizabeth's flushed cheeks, speaking volumes that neither needed to put into words. Chapter 7. Elizabeth woke to rain lashing the windows. Her first emotion was keen disappointment. No riding lesson today. Her second emotion was confusion. She had been dreaming, not of Atlas or racing across fields, but of Mr. Darcy, his patience with her, the way his reserve melted when he spoke of Miss Darcy or of his horses, the unexpected gentleness of the deep timbre of his voice when he teased, the attractive way his riding coat settled on his broad shoulders. Elizabeth pushed the dreams aside. Jane's health had improved until she was well enough that Miss Darcy had visited last evening. The girl charmed them both with her enthusiasm and her complete lack of Darcy pride. Yet it was her brother, not the sweet-natured Georgiana, who lingered in Elizabeth's thoughts. "Lizzie?" Jane's voice was soft from the adjoining room. "Are you awake?" "Yes." Elizabeth sat up and arranged her features into something approaching cheerfulness. The morning light penetrating the curtains was muted. "The rain woke me." "It will pass," Jane said. "I suspect that by this afternoon—" "Perhaps." Elizabeth could not keep the disappointment from her voice. She moved to the window as water streamed down the glass. The stable yard below was a sea of mud. Even if the rain stopped, the ground would be too treacherous for a beginner's first lesson. "Oh, Lizzie." Jane sat up in her bed, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. "I wanted nothing to interfere with your lessons." "It is only weather." Elizabeth pressed her palm against the cold glass. "Atlas will still be here when it clears. Mr. Darcy is not leaving immediately. But you wanted today." "I did." Elizabeth's throat constricted. "I wanted today very much." A knock at the door interrupted them. At Jane's invitation, Miss Darcy entered, already dressed for the day, in a simple morning gown of soft green. Miss Darcy moved to Jane's side, taking her hand. "I hope you rested well." "Thank you, Miss Darcy, and thank you for lending Lizzie your beautiful riding habit. It was very generous." "Not at all. I want—" She glanced at Elizabeth at the window. "I want Miss Elizabeth to have many occasions to wear it." Miss Darcy moved to Elizabeth's side. "You've seen the weather?" "Rather difficult to miss," Elizabeth said, attempting levity and failing. "I know you were disappointed. I would be as well. However, my brother asked me to extend an invitation. If you would, please, wear something that you will not mind getting a little soiled, and meet us in the entrance hall after you break your fast. We have an excursion planned." Elizabeth turned to stare at her. "In this weather?" "In this weather." Miss Darcy's smile was conspiratorial. "Please, it will be worth it, I promise." 15 minutes later, Elizabeth descended the stairs in a simple gown, the one she wore for long walks in questionable weather, the one she wore when she walked to Netherfield. Mr. Darcy was in the breakfast room with Colonel Fitzwilliam, both dressed for riding despite the rain. Miss Darcy joined them a moment later, and Mr. Bingley entered, his expression curious. "What is all this?" he asked cheerfully. "An expedition?" "Of sorts," Mr. Darcy said. He glanced at Elizabeth, and she saw anticipation, perhaps, or amusement. "Miss Elizabeth is going to learn about horses, even if she cannot ride today." "In the rain?" Miss Bingley's voice preceded her entrance as she swept into the room, her expression a mixture of disdain and curiosity. "How very rustic." "Miss Elizabeth will be mucking stables," Colonel Fitzwilliam said cheerfully, "getting her hands properly dirty. Character building, you know." Elizabeth saw the teasing glint in his eye, and knew he was baiting Miss Bingley deliberately. Sure enough, the woman's lips curved in a sharp smile. "How diverting," Miss Bingley said silkily. "A task well suited to a Bennet." The silence that followed was absolute. Mr. Darcy's expression hardened into something cold and forbidding. Colonel Fitzwilliam's easy smile vanished. Even Mr. Bingley looked shocked, his mouth opening as though to protest. The cut pierced Elizabeth like a physical blow, but she refused to show it. She lifted her chin, met Miss Bingley's gaze with cool dignity, then turned to Mr. Darcy. "Sir, might your carriage be made available? There has been a change of plans. Jane and I must return to Longbourn immediately." "Miss Elizabeth," Mr. Bingley began, "your sister is ill. She should not be moved." "Jane will travel regardless. We have imposed on Netherfield's hospitality long enough." She kept her voice steady, refusing to let it shake. "If you will excuse me, I must help Jane prepare." She turned toward the stairs, her vision blurring slightly, but her spine straight. "Miss Elizabeth, wait." Elizabeth turned as Mr. Bingley started forward. "You cannot mean to leave because of my sister's thoughtless—" "The carriage will be ready within the hour," Mr. Darcy said. His eyes never left Elizabeth's face. "I shall inform my driver." Elizabeth nodded once and ascended the staircase, the weight of Mr. Darcy's scrutiny on her shoulders. Once Elizabeth repeated Miss Bingley's insult, Jane understood immediately. She asked no questions, simply began gathering her things with Elizabeth's help. Within half an hour they were ready to depart. A small crowd had assembled in the entrance hall when they descended the grand staircase, Miss Bingley notably absent. Mr. Bingley hovered anxiously, clearly distressed. Mr. and Mrs. Hurst stood to the side, looking ill at ease. "Miss Bennet, please," Mr. Bingley said as Jane reached the bottom step. "There is no need to leave. My sister spoke out of turn. She will apologise. There is every need. Elizabeth said. "We are most grateful for your hospitality, Mr. Bingley." Miss Darcy appeared at Elizabeth's elbow, squeezing her hand briefly in support.
"The carriage is ready," Mr. Darcy said. "Colonel Fitzwilliam and I will ride alongside."
"In this weather?" Elizabeth protested. "Well, that is unnecessary."
"It is absolutely necessary," Colonel Fitzwilliam said. "No argument, Miss Elizabeth."
They were bundled into the carriage with surprising efficiency. Miss Darcy insisted on accompanying them, climbing inside despite Elizabeth's protests. "I shall not let you two travel alone," she said. "Not after that." Elizabeth glimpsed Mr. Darcy's face as he closed the carriage door, grim, determined, almost angry. Then the carriage lurched into motion. Elizabeth sat against the squabs, her hands gripping the edge of the seat. She would not cry. She would not give Miss Bingley that satisfaction. "Oh, Lizzie," Jane said. "I'm well enough." Elizabeth kept her attention fixed on the window. It was the correct decision. And it was. Jane's protection was far more precious than her own dream. If Miss Bingley could be so cruel in front of witnesses, what would she do to Jane in private? Jane, who saw only good in people. Jane, who would endure any cut with grace and never defend herself. The 3-mile journey to Longbourn felt interminable. As the rain fell, Elizabeth tried not to think about Atlas, waiting for her in Netherfield's stable. Tried not to mourn what she had given up, even if her disappointment hurt more than breathing. The carriage halted in front of Longbourn. Elizabeth looked out of the window and froze. Mr. Darcy sat astride Atlas in the pouring rain, not Gracie, not some other horse from Netherfield's stables. Atlas, standing patiently in the downpour, while his master's coat looked soaked through. Jacob, Longbourn's groom, hurried forward.
"Miss Elizabeth, Miss Jane."
He took in the Darcy crest on the carriage, the 2 gentlemen riders, and the young lady inside with the Bennet sisters.
"I'll see to the horses, sir."
"Thank you," Mr. Darcy said. Jacob called instructions to the carriage driver to pull under the stable overhang once the passengers disembarked, then moved to take Atlas's reins where Mr. Darcy dismounted. The horse went willingly, and Elizabeth was saddened to see him led away. The front door flew open, and Mrs. Bennet rushed out, heedless of the rain. "Jane! Oh, my dear Jane! Why are you here? I thought you would stay at Netherfield for weeks. Mr. Bingley was so attentive, and now— Elizabeth, what have you done? Did you offend someone? Did you ruin Jane's chances? Where is Mr. Bingley?" "Mamma, please." Jane tried to intervene, but their mother was not to be stopped. Then she became aware of Colonel Fitzwilliam's coat, and Mr. Darcy standing beside the carriage. Her expression transformed instantly. Oh, my, please, come in. You are soaked through. Come." Mr. Darcy stepped alongside her.
"Mrs. Bennet,"
he said with careful politeness.
"Thank you for your hospitality. However, I wonder if Miss Elizabeth might prefer to see to the horses first. They have travelled in unpleasant conditions."
"The horses? Lizzie?" Her mother shook her head. Elizabeth's eyes flew to his face. She saw the question there, the offer. "Yes," she breathed. "Yes, I would like that very much."
"Splendid,"
Colonel Fitzwilliam said cheerfully.
"Mrs. Bennet, if you would be so kind. Miss Darcy and I are quite in need of warming tea. Miss Bennet as well. She should be warm and dry as soon as possible."
He offered his arm to Mrs. Bennet, who preened at the attention, then guided Jane and Miss Darcy toward the house with practised ease. Within moments, Elizabeth stood alone with Mr. Darcy in the rain.
"The stables?"
He raised a playful brow. Rain pelted them as they ran toward the building, and Elizabeth laughed, truly laughed, with Mr. Darcy running beside her. They arrived breathless, her pelisse soaked through, mud clinging to her half-boots, but neither seemed to care. She marvelled at his persistence in protecting her from disappointment. Was this his attempt to apologise for the insult? If so, he acted perfectly to ease her heart. When they entered the stable, Jacob was already rubbing down Atlas. "May I finish that?" Elizabeth said, moving forward. Jacob looked up, surprised.
"Oh, Miss Elizabeth, you don't need to—"
"Please," she said. Jacob glanced at Mr. Darcy, who nodded. The groom handed Elizabeth the cloth. As Elizabeth approached the horse, he turned his head toward her, water still dripping from his mane, and huffed softly in greeting. "Good morning," she said in a hushed voice. She began to work, rubbing the cloth over his neck, his shoulders, his back. The motion was soothing, meditative. Atlas stood quietly, and Elizabeth exhaled, her tension easing. Mr. Darcy moved to the horse's other side, rubbing him down with the towel Jacob handed him.
"Miss Elizabeth, pray do not believe that I share Miss Bingley's opinions. Though she is proud of her conduct, her cruelty belies her claim of gentility."
Elizabeth considered each word. "I thank you, sir." He dipped his head.
"I would be remiss if I did not beg your forgiveness for causing you pain the night of the assembly. I never should have slighted you, for it has been many weeks since I concluded that you are one of the finest ladies of my acquaintance."
Heat rushed from her chest to her hair. "I accept your apology. Pray do not mention the assembly again." She moved to the horse's chest, rubbing in firm circles, and Atlas lowered his head and nudged her shoulder. A hug. Elizabeth's heart melted. She stood still, the weight of his head against her neck. She pulled off her gloves and handed them to Mr. Darcy. She reached up to stroke Atlas's cheek, and she felt a tear slide down her own, not from sadness, but from something more profound.
"He knows," Mr. Darcy said from behind her. "Already he knows you care for him."
Elizabeth could not speak, could not turn around. She simply stood there, Atlas's heavy head warm against her shoulder, his breath steady on her neck, appreciating everything she had tried so hard to contain. And in that moment, surrounded by the smell of wet horse and fresh hay, with rain drumming on the stable roof, and Mr. Darcy's presence across from her, the horse-loving child in Elizabeth dreamt again. She had fallen in love with a horse at 5 years old, but at 20, with Atlas's presence against her, and Mr. Darcy standing near, Elizabeth felt something shift inside her. The depth of it surprised her, how much she wanted not just the horse, but the man who had brought him. The realization made her pause from an overwhelming awareness that her heart wanted him, whether she was ready or not. Chapter 8. Once Atlas was settled, Mr. Darcy stuffed their gloves into his coat pocket. He clasped her hand in his as they dashed to the house. Elizabeth's gown clung to her legs, heavy with rain and mud, and she was acutely aware of Mr. Darcy beside her in equal disarray, the touch of her palm against his, sending shock waves up her arm. They did not speak. What was there to say after that moment in the stable? But the peace and joy she felt accompanied them. Longbourn's butler threw open the door, allowing them access, and taking their dripping outerwear. Elizabeth glanced up at Mr. Darcy. His smile grew as he pulled their dry gloves from his coat pockets and set them on a shelf above where their coats and hats hung. The drawing-room was chaotic. Her mother held court from her favourite chair, her voice carrying above all others, as she regaled Colonel Fitzwilliam with an account of Jane's illness and Mr. Bingley's attentiveness. Her father sat in the corner, ignoring them all. Mary was at the pianoforte, her fingers moving over the keys with more determination than skill. Kitty and Lydia flanked Miss Darcy on the sofa, talking over each other in their enthusiasm to learn everything about London. "And do you attend many balls, Miss Darcy? Oh, you must, with your brother's fortune and connections. Mamma, does not Miss Darcy have the most elegant pelisse? I should die for such a pelisse. And I am certain you know all the handsomest officers. Why, now that the militia are here, Meryton is teeming with attractive men in their scarlet tunics." Poor Miss Darcy looked rather like a rabbit cornered by hounds, her expression hovering between polite interest and alarm. Jane sat in the corner chair, her posture perfect despite obvious lethargy, doing her best to moderate the mayhem. She noticed Elizabeth in the doorway, and her shoulders eased. "Lizzie, there you are, and Mr. Darcy." Jane rose, swaying slightly. "Forgive me, but I find I must retire. The journey has fatigued me more than I anticipated." Elizabeth crossed to her side. "Come, I shall help you upstairs." "No, thank you, Lizzie." "Mamma," Jane said, her voice carrying just enough to cut through their mother's monologue, "would you be so kind as to assist me? I should like your company." Their mother's expression shifted from annoyance at the interruption to pleasure at being needed. "Of course, my dear, though I cannot think why you wish to leave such agreeable company. Colonel Fitzwilliam was just telling me about— well, never mind." Jane was not yet finished. "Come, Kitty, Lydia, Mary, you will attend me as well." "But, Mamma," Lydia began. "Now," Jane said, in a tone that brooked no argument, surprising them into action. The exodus was swift and complete. Within moments the drawing-room held only Elizabeth, Mr. Darcy, Colonel Fitzwilliam, Miss Darcy and Mr. Bennet, who had been observing the proceedings from behind his newspaper with evident amusement. He lowered the paper now, studying Elizabeth's muddy hem and Mr. Darcy's scuffed boots, as if they were clues to a mystery. "Well, this is an interesting morning. Lizzie, what is this about? Jane mentioned something about a horse." Elizabeth glanced at Mr. Darcy, uncertain how much to reveal. "Mr. Darcy has been generous enough to allow me the use of his horse, Atlas, for riding lessons. Atlas is currently in our stables, as he accompanied us from Netherfield." "I see. And you are home because—" "We had imposed on Miss Bingley long enough," Elizabeth said carefully. "Given that Longbourn is so close, there seemed little reason to remain." Her father's eyebrows rose. He was no fool, and Elizabeth knew he heard what she had not said. However, he merely folded his newspaper and set it aside. "Mr. Darcy," he said, "might I have a word with you? My study, if you would be so kind." Darcy inclined his head. "Of course." As the two men departed, Colonel Fitzwilliam moved to stand beside Miss Darcy. Elizabeth teased. "Well done, Miss Darcy. You survived the Bennet sisters with admirable composure." "They were very, enthusiastic," Miss Darcy said weakly. Elizabeth suppressed a smile. "I apologise for my family's exuberance. We are not often visited by such distinguished company." "Please do not apologise," Miss Darcy said earnestly. "They were kind, simply rather overwhelming in their kindness." In Mr. Bennet's study, Darcy stood before the desk, while Miss Elizabeth's father sank into his chair, with the air of a man preparing to be entertained. "So, a horse?" "Yes, sir. Atlas is a 25-year-old Cleveland Bay gelding. He has been with my family since I was 2 years old. My sister and I learnt to ride on him after outgrowing our ponies. He is now ready for retirement at Pemberley." Darcy kept his tone measured, factual. "I see. And you brought this horse from London to teach my daughter to ride?" "I did." "That is generous of you, Mr. Darcy." "It is practical, sir. As you are likely aware, the distance between here and Derbyshire is considerable. Having Atlas rest in Hertfordshire is a boon. He requires easy exercise, and Miss Elizabeth—" He continued, "Your daughter explained what happened to your young niece. I can only commend you for your caution while your daughters were young. However, your adult second daughter yearns to ride. If I can remedy that situation, even temporarily, I consider it a privilege rather than a burden." Mr. Bennet considered him for a long moment. "Lizzie stopped asking for a riding horse years ago. I thought she had forgotten about it, or perhaps decided it did not matter. Now I find she has not forgotten at all. She simply learnt not to hope for what she could not have." "I believe so, sir." "And now there is a horse in my stables, a horse my daughter already adores, if I am understanding the situation." Mr. Bennet's expression was resigned, rather than angry.
When you take Atlas away to Pemberley, Mr. Darcy, I shall have no peace. Lizzie will not ask, she never does, but I shall know, and my wife will certainly ask, loudly and repeatedly." "I understand, sir." "Do you? Because it seems to me, Mr. Darcy, that you have created a situation from which there is no comfortable retreat for any of us."
Mr. Bennet leant back into his chair.
"However, I suppose the damage is done. You and your family are welcome at Longbourn whenever you wish to call. I'm always at my leisure."
It was not quite a blessing, but neither was it a prohibition. Darcy inclined his head.
"Thank you, sir. That is most generous." "Is it? I wonder."
Mr. Bennet picked up his newspaper again, signalling the conversation's end.
"I suspect we shall all discover the answer to that question in due time."
The return journey to Netherfield began with plans and enthusiasm, despite the continued rain. Georgiana sat beside Darcy, already chattering about what Elizabeth should learn first. "She has excellent instincts," Georgiana said. "She will be a natural rider, of this I am certain."
"We will start with the basics," Darcy said. "Mounting, dismounting, proper seat. We will guard against being too ambitious until she has confidence." "Which can be learnt inside the stable while it is raining," Richard said.
"And I can ride beside her once she is ready," Georgiana added. "Our horses will look lovely together. Atlas is bay and Starlight's grey." Richard, whose hired mount was tied to the back of the carriage, said,
"Perhaps we should plan a proper ride once Miss Elizabeth has mastered the basics. Through the countryside, at a nice gentle pace." "Let us not get ahead of ourselves,"
Darcy said, though he smiled at their enthusiasm. They entered Meryton's High Street, the carriage slowing to navigate the foot traffic despite the rain. Shops lined both sides of the road, their windows glowing with lamplight against the gloom. A few hardy souls hurried along the walkways, umbrellas tilted against the weather. And there, standing beneath the eaves of the inn, with a group of red-coated officers, was a man who looked entirely too familiar. Darcy's entire body became rigid. He knew that posture, that easy stance, the calculated nonchalance with which the man leant against the wall. Even at this distance, even through rain-streaked glass, Darcy recognised Wickham instantly. Wickham looked up as the carriage passed. His eyes widened, then narrowed. He straightened from the wall, observing the Darcy crest on the carriage door. A challenge sparked in the look they exchanged. Wickham's expression shifted through surprise to calculation, to something that might have been satisfaction. Then he smiled, that charming smile that Darcy had learnt long ago to distrust, and sketched a mocking half-bow. "Brother?" Georgiana's voice quavered. She followed his gaze. "Is that... It cannot be."
"Do not look at him."
Darcy's voice came out harsher than he intended. He forced himself to gentle his tone.
"Georgiana, look at me, not at him, at me."
Her face paled. Her hands trembled in her lap. "What is he doing here?"
"I do not know."
Darcy pulled her close, letting her hide her face against his shoulder. Over her head, he caught Richard's eye. His cousin had seen Wickham too. Richard's expression hardened, the look of a soldier assessing a threat.
"Let us get Georgiana to Netherfield," Richard said. "I will return to investigate." "Richard, your priority is your sister. Mine is finding out what that rake is doing in Meryton, and whether he poses an immediate threat."
Richard's jaw was tight.
"I will return to Netherfield as soon as I know something."
The carriage rolled on, leaving Meryton behind. Darcy held Georgiana as she quivered like a leaf, her face still pressed against his coat. He managed to share reassurances that rang hollow in his own ears.
"Wickham, here, in Meryton."
It could not be a coincidence. Yet Wickham did nothing without calculation, without purpose. He was here for a reason, and that reason could only be money or revenge. Darcy's mind raced through possibilities, each more troubling than the last. How had Wickham heard of Darcy's presence in Hertfordshire? Did he know about Georgiana's visit? Was he already spreading lies, poisoning the neighbourhood against the Darcy name? Or worse, had someone mentioned Elizabeth, learnt of Darcy's interest in her? The thought made his blood run cold. Wickham was vindictive, charming, and utterly without scruple. If he discovered Darcy cared for Elizabeth Bennet, he would use that information to cause maximum damage. "Brother?" Georgiana turned her head away from him. I wish I had made better choices. I have so many regrets because of him."
"Hush. You have no need to regret, Georgiana."
Darcy pressed a kiss to the top of her head.
"We shall sort this out. Richard will discover what Wickham wants, and we shall deal with it, together."
"He saw us. He knows we are here."
"Yes, he knows."
Darcy stared out of the window at the rain-soaked countryside, his jaw taut.
"Which means we must be careful."
The carriage rolled on toward Netherfield, away from Meryton and the threat that lurked there. But Darcy knew, with cold, absolute certainty, that this was not the end. Wickham could not merely threaten Georgiana's future. He could threaten the future that Darcy had only just begun to imagine was possible with Elizabeth. Chapter 9. Richard arrived at Netherfield as the sun dipped toward the horizon, his borrowed mount lathered despite the cold. A groom met him at the stable, and the colonel dismounted with barely a word of thanks, before striding toward the house. He found Darcy in the library, a book open, but clearly unread in his lap. His cousin looked up the moment Richard entered.
"Well?"
Richard closed the door firmly behind him.
"Wickham arrived in Meryton with the militia less than a se'nnight ago. The louse is already in debt to half his fellow officers from cards."
He crossed to the sideboard and poured himself a brandy.
"Not an hour ago he was overheard assuring his creditors that a golden opportunity had presented itself only this morning. Enough money, he claimed, to settle his future."
Darcy's countenance turned to stone.
"This morning. The very morning he sees Georgiana."
Richard downed half his drink.
"The timing cannot be coincidence." "It never is with Wickham."
Darcy rose, setting the book aside with barely controlled violence. Richard set down his glass, his usual levity gone.
"Darcy, if he approaches her, if he threatens to expose what happened at Ramsgate, he will not get near her."
Darcy's voice was flat, absolute.
"He does not need to."
Richard dragged a hand through his hair.
"He could destroy her reputation with a few well-placed words. Or worse, convince her he still cares for her. Georgiana knows what he is now. Does she? Or does she simply know she disappointed you?"
Richard's tone was rough.
"She was 15, Darcy. In love, or what she believed was love. Wickham is skilled at making young women believe exactly what he wants them to believe."
Darcy's fists clenched.
"What does his commanding officer say?"
"That he had no knowledge of Wickham's character when he accepted his commission. I enlightened him. Mentioned debts, gambling, a pattern of preying on young women." Richard paused.
"Forster is a decent man. He has agreed to reassign Wickham to Newcastle, but it will take time to arrange without raising suspicion. A week, perhaps more."
"A week?" Darcy turned toward the window, his hands clasped tightly behind his back.
"What is Wickham's plan, Richard? It has to be blackmail. Despite my threats, he knows I would pay handsomely to keep Ramsgate quiet.
Or he might approach Georgiana directly, in one of the shops or at church. Convince her to run away again, this time successfully. Her £30,000 would solve all his problems."
"Over my dead body?"
"It may come to that if he grows desperate enough." Richard moved to stand beside his cousin. "We must be vigilant. Georgiana does not leave Netherfield without both of us. No trips to Meryton, no morning calls. Nothing until he is gone. Neither should you go anywhere alone."
"I agree. He will not hurt Georgiana again, and he will not touch anyone else I care for."
The emphasis on the last words was not lost on Richard. He raised an eyebrow.
"Anyone else?" "Do not start, Richard. I am not starting anything. Merely observing that you seem particularly concerned about a young lady at Longbourn, one who happens to love horses as much as you do. This is not the time. There is never a good time with you, cousin." But Richard's tone softened. "We will sort out Wickham together, as we always do."
Darcy gripped his cousin's shoulder briefly.
"Thank you. What are cousins for, if not to clean up after scoundrels and point out when you are falling in love? Richard, go. Tell Georgiana our restrictions."
Richard waved him off with a grin that did not quite reach his eyes.
"Before I say something else you will pretend not to hear."
The next morning Elizabeth joined her father, who was already ensconced in the breakfast room with his coffee, absorbed in the morning's news. "Good morning, Papa."
"Lizzie."
He lowered the paper enough to peer at her over the top.
"You look as cheerful as the weather. Disappointed about your riding lesson, I suppose?"
"The rain will eventually pass."
"Eventually is not today, however."
He raised the paper again.
"Your mother lamented the loss of Mr. Bingley until late. I thought it prudent to seek refuge before she began cataloguing every manner in which you have ruined Jane's prospects."
Elizabeth sighed and poured tea. "She blames me entirely, I suppose."
"Naturally, though I confess I am more interested in what Miss Bingley said to prompt your hasty departure. Your mother's account is so coloured by hysteria that I cannot extract the truth of it."
The sound of a carriage on the drive made them both look toward the window. Through the glass, she saw the Darcy crest on the door.
"Well," Mr. Bennet said mildly, "it seems your gentleman caller is undeterred by inclement weather. How very devoted."
"He is not—" Elizabeth began, but her father's knowing look silenced her protest. Hill appeared in the doorway. "Mr. Darcy, Colonel Fitzwilliam and Miss Darcy have arrived. They are proceeding directly to the stables, Miss Elizabeth. Mr. Darcy asked if you might wear the riding habit and join them there." Elizabeth was already rising, her breakfast forgotten. "Tell them I shall be there immediately."
"Lizzie," her father called as she hurried to her chambers. "Take a cloak. You will catch your death running about in this weather, and then your mother will blame me for that as well."
The stable felt like a sanctuary. Outside rain poured in sheets, but inside all was dry and warm. Atlas stood with his head over the door, ears pricked forward with interest at the unusual activity. Mr. Darcy spoke with Jacob. Colonel Fitzwilliam leant against a post, looking remarkably cheerful for a man who had ridden 3 miles in a downpour. And Miss Darcy sat on an overturned bucket, her riding habit damp, but her expression bright. "Miss Elizabeth!" Miss Darcy rose when Elizabeth entered. "We were beginning to think you might not brave the weather. And miss a day with Atlas. Never." After greeting everyone, Elizabeth went directly to the animal, unable to resist stroking the horse's soft nose. "Good morning. I hope you slept well in our humble quarters." Atlas huffed warm breath against her palm, and Elizabeth's spirits lifted despite the dismal weather.
"He settled beautifully," Jacob reported. "At his breakfast, no signs of distress."
Mr. Darcy's groom joined them, brushing raindrops from his coat as he walked toward the box. Sam nodded his approval as he ran his hand up Atlas's neck to scratch behind his ears.
"He is a contented fellow, indeed."
"Excellent." Mr. Darcy's expression was warm.
"I hope you do not mind our invasion, Miss Elizabeth. I know the weather is not conducive to riding, but I thought we might begin your education regardless."
"Begin?" Elizabeth could not hide her eagerness. "Even in the rain?"
"Especially in the rain,"
Colonel Fitzwilliam said with a grin.
"One cannot control the weather after all. Better to learn in less than ideal conditions and be prepared for anything."
"My cousin exaggerates," Mr. Darcy said.
"We will not be riding today. However, there is much to learn before you ever sit in a saddle. Would you like to begin?"
"Oh, yes, please." What followed was the most instructive morning. Jacob and Sam showed her how to groom Atlas, how to use the currycomb and brush properly, how to check his hooves for stones, and how to run her hands down his legs to check for heat or swelling that might indicate injury.
"A horse cannot tell you when he is in pain," Mr. Darcy explained,
running his ungloved hands along Atlas's leg.
"You must learn to read the signs. Here, this is how the bone should feel. Cool, firm. If you ever detect heat or swelling, that is cause for concern."
Elizabeth absorbed everything: the geography of Atlas's body, the powerful shoulders, the sensitive areas behind his ears that made him lean into her touch, the spot on his chest he loved scratched.
"You have good hands," Mr. Darcy said as she worked. "Gentle but confident. That is important. Horses sense hesitation."
"Like people," Elizabeth said, then flushed when she realised she had spoken aloud.
"Yes."
His eyes held hers.
"Very like people."
Jacob stepped forward with the bridle. Sam carried a side saddle that must have belonged to Miss Darcy. Sam said,
"It is our job to see to the horse, miss. However, Mr. Darcy's father insisted that Lady Anne and Miss Darcy learn to saddle a horse."
Miss Darcy showed her how to fit the bridle, how to hold the bit, so Atlas would take it willingly. "Never force. Wait until he opens his mouth. See? Like this. He is willing. You need only to be gentle." The saddle came next, far heavier than Elizabeth had imagined. She struggled to lift it, and Mr. Darcy stepped in to help, his hands steadying hers as they set it onto Atlas's back.
"The girth must be snug," he explained,
his voice close to her ear as he showed her how to fasten it.
"But not too tight. You should be able to slide 2 fingers beneath it. Here, try."
Her hands fumbled with the leather straps, acutely aware of Mr. Darcy's nearness. Atlas stood still through it all.
"Well done,"
Mr. Darcy said, when she finally had the girth properly secured.
"Now, would you like to sit on him?"
Elizabeth felt like she might burst from anticipation. "I can ride?"
"No riding today," he explained. "Simply sitting. Sam will hold his head, and I will be right beside you."
"I see. However, just know that Atlas is welcome to move if he wants to." A smile tugged at Mr. Darcy's lips. Her heart hammered as he led Atlas into the centre aisle, where there was more room. Sam took a position at the horse's head, one hand on the bridle, murmuring reassurances. Jacob positioned the mounting block. "The side saddle requires a different balance." Miss Darcy ran her hand over the leather. "Both legs go on the left side, and your right leg hooks over this upper pommel for security. It seems precarious at first, but Atlas is so steady you will hardly notice." "It looks complicated." "It is," Miss Darcy said candidly, "which is why we start slowly."
"Miss Elizabeth, if you will step up on the block and face me," Jacob instructed. "I shall make a cradle with my hands for your left foot."
Elizabeth hopped onto the block. Jacob laced his fingers together at knee height.
"And place your left foot in my hands," he said. "When you are ready, spring upward. Mr. Darcy and I will guide you until you are above the saddle. Then you will come to rest with your right leg hooked over the upper pommel and your left foot finding the stirrup. Do not worry, we will not let you fall." "I will steady you from the other side," Mr. Darcy added, positioning himself at Atlas's right shoulder, where he could reach across to support her if needed. Elizabeth took a breath, placed her left foot in Jacob's linked hands, gripped the pommels with both hands, and pushed off the mounting block. Jacob lifted smoothly, guiding her upward, and she seemed to hang suspended in the air before settling onto the saddle. Mr. Darcy steadied her as she found her balance. His touch, even through layers of fabric, sent her heart racing. Seated upon Atlas, sitting higher than she had imagined, the world looked entirely different. The side saddle position felt precarious. She gripped the front of the saddle as she tried to find her balance in this unfamiliar arrangement. Mr. Darcy's hand remained at her waist, and Elizabeth was acutely aware of every point of contact between them. "Breathe," Mr. Darcy said. "You are safe. I have you."
"I have you." The words wrapped around her like a promise. Even though every instinct told her she would slide off, slowly, Elizabeth loosened her grip. The side saddle became less foreign. She became aware of Atlas's strength beneath her, the incredible reality of sitting atop this magnificent creature. Atlas shifted his weight, drawing a gasp from Elizabeth. "Oh, this is—"
"Everything?"
Mr. Darcy's voice held gentle amusement. Yes, this is everything." Miss Darcy moved to stand beside her brother, her eyes bright. "You look wonderful up there, Miss Elizabeth, like you were meant to ride."
"She does,"
Mr. Darcy agreed, and the warmth in his voice made Elizabeth's cheeks flush.
"I suppose she will be ready to race Georgie within a week or so."
The Colonel grinned. She sat for several moments, learning the balance required, how to hold her shoulders and her legs against Atlas's sides. Miss Darcy explained how to distribute her weight evenly. When she finally dismounted, with considerably less grace than mounting had required, she felt more alive than she had in years. "Oh, that was extraordinary," she said, turning to stroke Atlas's neck. "Thank you, all of you. This was—" Her voice broke. "I cannot adequately express what this means to me."
"There is no need," Mr. Darcy said. "Your smile says it all."
They broke for tea when Hill came to announce that her mother insisted the gentleman and Miss Darcy join them in the house. Elizabeth tried to protest. Surely they could simply have a tray sent to the stables. But Colonel Fitzwilliam smilingly shook his head and said they would not insult their hostess. Mrs. Bennet presided over the gathering with determined cheer, and through it all, Elizabeth saw Mr. Darcy's lips twitch with suppressed amusement. Soon, much to the pleasure of Mrs. Bennet, Mr. Bingley was announced. "Mr. Bingley!" Her mother's voice could have shattered glass. "How delightful! We had thought— oh, that is to say, Jane, my dear, look who has come to call." Bingley failed to notice anyone else in the room. His attention fixed immediately on Jane, his face lighting with such pleasure that even their mother could not mistake his attachment.
"Miss Bennet," he said, moving to her side, "I am pleased you are looking so well. I've been extremely worried. That is, we have all been worried."
He must have realised he was making a spectacle of himself. He turned to include the others.
"Darcy, Colonel, Miss Darcy, I did not expect to find you here." "Bingley?"
Mr. Darcy nodded. Her mother was not one to overlook an opportunity. "Do join us, Mr. Bingley." To Mary, she gestured for her to move to another chair, so he could sit next to Jane.
Yes, thank you."
Bingley took the seat, still unable to look away from Jane. When asked, Bingley mentioned, with obvious discomfort, that his sister Caroline had departed to stay with their aunt in the north.
"Louisa is serving as my hostess now," he said, not meeting anyone's eyes. "I thought it best, that is to say, Caroline's behaviour was inexcusable, and I will not have anyone under my roof who treats my guests with such disrespect."
Elizabeth's esteem for him grew. It could not have been easy to banish his own sister.
"You have made the right decision," Mr. Darcy said, "though I am sorry you were put in such a position." "As am I, but some things cannot be tolerated."
Bingley glanced at Jane.
"Some people are far too important to lose over another's pride and prejudice."
The words hung in the air, weighted with meaning. Jane's cheeks flushed pink. Her mother looked as though someone had just settled 5,000 a year on her eldest. After tea they returned to the stables, where the afternoon was spent in further instruction. Elizabeth learnt to lead Atlas, to make him walk forward and halt with pressure from the lead rope. Mr. Darcy's assistance grew more hands-on as the afternoon progressed. His fingers covered hers to adjust her grip on the rope, his hand at her elbow guiding her position beside the horse. Each touch, though proper enough with others present, carried an awareness that made Elizabeth's pulse quicken. When Elizabeth examined the bridle Jacob held, Mr. Darcy stepped close behind her, his hand resting briefly at her waist as he pointed out the various parts. The touch was fleeting, easily explained as steadying her reach, but the tenderness in his eyes when she glanced back at him told her it was much more. As the afternoon faded toward evening, Mr. Darcy called an end to the lesson.
"We should gather Bingley and return to Netherfield before dark. The roads will be slow going with all this rain.
Will you come tomorrow? Elizabeth could not hide her eagerness.
Yes.
His eyes held hers.
There is more to learn.
I should like that. They prepared to depart. Colonel Fitzwilliam handed Miss Darcy into the carriage, while Mr. Darcy lingered behind. He stood close enough that Elizabeth saw the raindrops in his hair, could smell the wet wool of his coat. "Thank you," she said, "for today, for all of this. I know you must have better things to do than spend a rainy day teaching me about horses."
"This is exactly where I wish to be."
The intensity in his voice made her throat constrict.
"Truly."
He held her gaze, then bowed and climbed inside the carriage. She pressed her hand to her rapidly beating heart. She was falling in love with Mr. Darcy. The realization should have frightened her. Instead, it felt as inevitable as the rain. The next morning, the rain had lessened to a heavy mist that clung to the ground like a gossamer veil. Elizabeth woke before dawn, too excited to sleep, dressed in a riding habit, and went directly to the stables to check on Atlas. She found Jacob already there, mucking the stables with practised efficiency.
"Good morning, Miss Elizabeth. You're up early."
"I could not sleep." She moved to Atlas's box, pleased when the horse nickered at her approach. "Good morning to you too, handsome," Jacob said.
"He's a gentleman, that one."
"He is." Elizabeth let herself into the box, running her hands over Atlas's neck, then his shoulder. Already the shape of him mapped itself onto her memory. The sound of carriage wheels on the drive made her turn. Even through the mist, she recognised Mr. Darcy's conveyance. They had come. Despite the weather, despite the early hour, they had come. Elizabeth's smile was so wide it hurt.
"It is not ideal riding weather,"
Mr. Darcy said, eyeing the mist with evident misgiving.
"But it is better than yesterday. We could walk Atlas down the stable aisle with you mounted, at least, get you accustomed to movement."
"Please," Elizabeth said. "I'm ready." They saddled Atlas together, Elizabeth performing each step with Mr. Darcy's guidance, her confidence growing. When she was ready to mount, she needed less help than yesterday, her body remembering the movement. Sitting atop Atlas felt more natural today, less terrifying, more thrilling.
"Richard, if you would take his head," Mr. Darcy instructed. "Walk slowly. Miss Elizabeth, hold the reins as I showed you yesterday. There, just so. Do not pull. Simply maintain contact. Atlas will do the work."
The colonel clicked his tongue, and the horse stepped forward. Elizabeth's pulse leapt. Atlas's gait was smooth, rolling, and she could feel every muscle shifting, every step reverberating through her body. Her hands gripped the reins too tightly, and she felt Atlas's mouth react to the pressure.
"Soften your hands,"
Mr. Darcy said, walking beside her.
"Trust him. He knows what to do."
Elizabeth breathed deeply, forcing her hands to relax. Atlas continued his steady walk down the length of the stable, turned and walked back, forward and back, until Elizabeth's body began to move with him rather than against him. "Beautiful!" Miss Darcy called from alongside Sam. "Miss Elizabeth, you look beautiful." Elizabeth was lost in the rhythm of riding the magnificent animal. When they finally halted, and Jacob helped her dismount, Elizabeth's legs shook, and her face hurt from smiling. Mr. Darcy said,
"If the weather clears, tomorrow we shall try the lane. Just a short walk outside. Would you like that?"
"More than anything." She did not add that she would like it even more if he continued to walk beside her, his presence steadying, his encouragement warming her more than any sun could manage. But perhaps he already knew. Chapter 10. The next morning the stable yard was bathed in golden light when she arrived, and Atlas stood in the paddock, his bay coat gleaming. He raised his head when he saw her, ears pricked forward. He nickered softly. "Good morning, handsome boy," Elizabeth called, moving to the fence. "Today is the day. Today we ride properly."
"Talking to horses now, Miss Elizabeth?"
Colonel Fitzwilliam's voice came from behind her.
"A sure sign of either great affection or mild madness."
"Perhaps both," Elizabeth said with a smile, as she looked to where the riders were assembled. "Good morning, Miss Darcy, Colonel, Mr. Darcy, Mr. Bingley. Good morning, Sam." Mr. Bingley dismounted with his usual eager energy.
"I hope you do not mind my joining your party. When Darcy mentioned he was coming to Longbourn this morning, I could not resist."
"You are always welcome, sir. My father is in his book-room if you wish to call on him. The others have not come down yet." Mr. Bingley's expression showed dismay at the prospect.
Perhaps, that is, I should hate to disturb him. If you do not mind, might I stay here, watch the riding lesson?"
Elizabeth suppressed a smile. She could hardly blame him for avoiding her father's sardonic presence. "Of course, you are most welcome."
"Excellent. Capital."
Mr. Bingley's relief was palpable. Mr. Darcy dismounted with effortless grace and moved to stand beside Elizabeth at the fence.
"Are you ready?"
"I've been ready since I was 5 years old." A ghost of a smile touched his lips.
"Then let us make up for lost time."
Elizabeth manoeuvred onto the saddle far more assured than the day prior.
"Perfect," Mr. Darcy said from his position beside Atlas. "You look like you were born for this."
"I was." Mr. Darcy swung up onto Gracie, the chestnut mare dancing sideways, with barely contained energy. The contrast between the two horses was striking. Atlas, steady and dignified, Gracie, alert and eager. Rather opposite their riders, Elizabeth thought, then felt her cheeks warm at the notion. She was not nearly as steady and dignified as her horse.
"We shall walk to the lane and return,"
Mr. Darcy said, settling Gracie with gentle pressure. They set out in procession, and not long after, the Colonel suggested he, Bingley and Miss Darcy ride further afield, to give Atlas some room. Miss Darcy and Colonel Fitzwilliam's easy banter floated back to her in the morning air as they rode out. Elizabeth heard snatches of conversation, something about another race, and teasing laughter that spoke of years of affection. The rhythm of Atlas's walk was different outside, more purposeful, his head higher, his attention on the world around them.
"Are you well?"
Mr. Darcy asked. Gracie pranced beside them. "I am, sir. This is far better than our plough horse," Elizabeth admitted breathlessly. "I keep expecting to wake up and find this was all a dream."
"It is no dream."
His eyes held hers.
"This is real."
They reached the lane that led toward Meryton. Trees arched overhead, their leaves still wet from days of rain, creating a tunnel of dappled light. The knot of longing Elizabeth had carried for 15 years finally began to unravel. "This is everything I imagined," she said. "Everything and more."
"Then we shall do it again tomorrow," Mr. Darcy said, "and the day after."
"Are you certain?"
"I never say what I do not mean, Miss Elizabeth."
They turned before reaching the main road, and Elizabeth felt a pang of disappointment when the stable came into view. She wanted to ride for hours, for days.
"The next ride we shall go farther," Mr. Darcy said, as though reading her thoughts. "But not too far, too fast. Restraint is as important as enthusiasm."
"I shall try to remember," Elizabeth said, "though I make no promises." When Jacob helped her dismount, she felt gloriously happy. Atlas turned his head to nuzzle her shoulder, and she threw her arms around his neck in an impulsive embrace. "Thank you," she said into his mane. "Thank you for being so at ease with me." Mr. Darcy grinned beside her.
"Miss Elizabeth, you look as though you have been riding for years."
"Hardly," Elizabeth said, "but it was wonderful." By the time they all had returned to the stable yard and dismounted, Hill had clearly roused the household. They entered to find the drawing-room considerably more crowded than when Elizabeth had left.
"There you are!"
Mrs. Bennet exclaimed from her favourite chair. Mr. Bingley, how delightful! And Mr. Darcy, Colonel Fitzwilliam, Miss Darcy, such distinguished company so early in the day."
Jane sat on the sofa, looking serene and lovely. Lydia, Kitty and Mary seemed distinctly disgruntled at the early hour.
"We should have been allowed to sleep,"
Lydia complained, earning a sharp look from her mother.
"Though I suppose if we must be up at this ungodly hour, we can go to Meryton earlier, to be in company with the officers."
"The officers will not be available until afternoon at the earliest," Colonel Fitzwilliam said with amusement. "Military discipline requires morning drills, Miss Lydia."
"Oh."
Lydia's face fell, then brightened.
"Well, perhaps we shall see my favourite today. I do hope Mr. Wickham has returned from whatever important assignment took him from Meryton."
A look passed between Colonel Fitzwilliam and Mr. Darcy, brief but significant. Miss Darcy paled. "I believe Mr. Wickham has been called away on extended duties," Colonel Fitzwilliam said smoothly. "One cannot always choose one's assignments."
"Oh, how disappointing!"
Lydia pouted.
"He was so very charming."
Kitty sighed.
"All the officers are handsome, but none so agreeable as Mr. Wick. I'm certain there are many agreeable gentlemen in the neighbourhood."
Mrs. Bennet glanced toward Bingley. Mr. Bingley had moved to stand near Jane, his attention entirely fixed on her despite the surrounding tension.
"Miss Bennet, you were looking remarkably well this morning."
Jane's cheeks flushed pink. "Thank you, Mr. Bingley. I am much improved."
"I am glad to hear it. Glad indeed."
He seemed to realise he was staring, and turned to include the rest of the room.
"And what a beautiful day it has turned out to be. Perfect for riding. Miss Elizabeth, you must be delighted."
"I am," Elizabeth said, unable to contain her smile. "Lizzie has always been passionate about horses," Jane said, "even as a child."
"Then it is a crime she has been denied them for so long,"
Mr. Darcy said. An awkward silence fell. Her mother's expression suggested she understood the implicit criticism of her husband and herself. However, for once, she had the grace not to protest. Mr. Bennet appeared in the doorway. He surveyed the crowded drawing-room with raised eyebrows.
"Good morning, gentlemen, ladies. My, what an impressive gathering. I believe this is more company than Longbourn typically sees in a fortnight."
"Papa," Elizabeth said with a grimace.
"I'm merely making an observation, Lizzie."
"Sir." Mr. Bingley caught her father's attention.
"Miss Elizabeth's progress on Atlas has been extraordinary. So Mrs. Bennet has informed me, at length, repeatedly."
Fortunately, his tone was considerate rather than cutting.
"I'm pleased for Lizzie. She has wanted to ride for a very long time."
He moved to his wife.
"Well, since you have all descended upon us at this ungodly hour, and I use the term with affection, you might as well join us to break your fast. Mrs. Bennet?"
"Of course. Come, everyone. Let us go through to the dining-room."
The meal passed in its usual commotion. Lydia and Kitty giggled until their mother silenced them with a look. Mary attempted to quote from one of Fordyce's sermons, until their father suggested she save her wisdom for after the meal, when people might be better able to appreciate it. Through it all, Mr. Bingley could not tear his gaze from Jane. And Mr. Darcy, Elizabeth noticed, seemed equally unable to look away from her. The realization thrilled her. After breakfast, the guests readied themselves to depart. "Tomorrow?" Elizabeth asked hesitantly, as Mr. Darcy prepared to mount Gracie.
"Yes, and perhaps we shall venture onto the bridle way towards Lucas Lodge, if you believe you are ready."
"I shall be ready." Elizabeth's heart beat rapidly. He bowed over her hand.
"I believe you."
Then they rode away, and the next day could not come soon enough. Early the next morning, Elizabeth hurried to the stable, eager to check on Atlas before Mr. Darcy arrived. The stable door stood open. Elizabeth's steps slowed as a queer sensation rolled over her. Jacob always secures the door at night. Elizabeth stood frozen, unable to process the sight before her. Atlas's box was empty, the hay undisturbed, the water bucket full.
Was he in the paddock? She ran outside, shading her eyes against the rising sun. He was nowhere to be seen. "No," she cried. "No, no, no!" She looked in the other boxes, as though she might find him hiding in a corner. She checked the tack room, the paddock again. Atlas was gone. She pressed a hand to the door, suddenly dizzy, sick. Where was he? Had he somehow broken free, wandered off in the night? "Jacob!" Elizabeth's voice came out as a strangled cry. "Jacob, where are you?" The groom climbed down from the hayloft, rubbing sleep from his eyes. He had clearly spent the night there, as he sometimes did when checking on the animals.
"Miss Elizabeth, what is wrong?"
He noticed the empty box and went white.
"The horse! Where is the horse?"
"I do not know. I came this morning and found him gone. The door was open, the box empty. Jacob, where is he?"
"I do not know, miss. I swear I locked everything last night. I always do. I was up late with one of the farm horses. I didn't hear."
He ran his hands over the door as though searching for evidence.
"The latch was not forced, so the horse did not kick his way out. Someone opened it properly."
Dread turned the blood in her veins to ice. Someone had taken Atlas, in the night, while they all slept. "We need Mr. Darcy and Colonel Fitzwilliam," she said, her voice shaking. "Ride quickly to Netherfield with the message that Atlas is gone." Jacob hurried to saddle one of the plough horses, while Elizabeth sank onto a bale of hay, her hands trembling. She pressed her face into her palms and tried not to cry. Chapter 11. The sound of hoofbeats, many hoofbeats, broke through Elizabeth's despair. She looked up as riders poured into the stable-yard. Even Mr. Hurst had come, looking unusually alert astride a chestnut gelding. Mr. Darcy had leapt from the saddle before Gracie had fully stopped, striding into the stable, with an expression Elizabeth had never seen before. Fury and fear warring for dominance.
"What has happened? Are you well?"
was all he said. "I can hardly say." Elizabeth's voice broke. "His box was empty when I arrived this morning. Jacob says the lock was not forced. Someone had access." Mr. Darcy moved to Atlas's box, examining the door, the latch and the surrounding area with methodical intensity. Colonel Fitzwilliam joined him, his soldier's eye cataloguing details. The colonel struck his fist into his palm.
"No one in their right mind would want an old horse unless they knew what the animal meant to the owner. This was calculated. Against you, Darcy."
"Wickham."
Mr. Darcy's voice was flat, certain. "But you said he was gone," Elizabeth protested. "Called away on extended duties."
"I believed it to be true."
The colonel's jaw flexed.
"After we saw him in Meryton, I spoke with his commanding officer. I was assured that he would be reassigned. Until then, he was to be kept in the camp. But if he took Atlas—"
Mr. Darcy's hands fisted at his sides.
"He has been here all along, watching, waiting."
The sound of footsteps made them all turn. The entire Bennet family had descended on the stable. "Lizzie, what has happened?" Jane, pale with concern, moved to her sister's side. "Atlas is gone. Stolen in the night." Mrs. Bennet, wringing her hands, gasped. "Stolen? Oh, how dreadful! Mr. Bennet, you must do something."
"What would you have me do, madam? I have no horse to pursue a thief. Our animals are fit for ploughing, not riding."
Mr. Bennet looked grim, his tone charged with self-recrimination.
"I cannot even assist in searching for a horse removed from my own property."
"I do not understand why you are so concerned, Mr. Darcy," Lydia said, her stance akimbo, though her eyes darted between Mr. Darcy and the colonel. "It is not even your horse." The silence that followed was absolute.
"What did you say?"
Mr. Darcy's voice was dangerously calm. "Atlas, he's not yours. You had no right to keep him in the first place." Lydia's chin lifted. "So I do not see why everyone is acting as though something terrible has happened. Justice has been served." "Lydia!" Their mother's voice was shrill with alarm. "What are you talking of?" "I spoke with Mr. Wickham last evening, on the path between here and Lucas Lodge. He was with Captain Denny."
Lydia's words came faster, defensive.
"He told me everything, how Mr. Darcy's father promised him both Atlas and a valuable living, but when his father died, Mr. Darcy withheld them both out of spite. Mr. Wickham has been denied what is rightfully his for years. He did not steal Atlas, he merely took what belongs to him."
Blood drained from Elizabeth's face. "Oh, Lydia, what have you done?"
"I helped correct an injustice."
Lydia's voice rose.
"Mr. Wickham was so grateful when I showed him where Atlas was kept. He said I was a true friend, that I had helped right a terrible wrong."
Their father had gone very still. "You showed him? You brought this Mr. Wickham to our stables?"
"Yes, and I would do it again."
Lydia's impudence crumbled at the edges, uncertainty creeping in as she saw the horror on every face.
"He deserved to have what was stolen from him. Mr. Darcy is so rich, so proud. Why should he keep what rightfully belongs to someone else?"
"Miss Lydia," Mr. Darcy said, his voice like ice, "Atlas was never promised to George Wickham. My father bred Atlas specifically for me when I was in leading strings. That horse has been mine for 25 years. Wickham has no claim on him whatsoever."
"But he said—"
"He lied." Mr. Darcy's jaw clenched, as he always lies. "The living was never withheld," Colonel Fitzwilliam said, his voice hard. "It was offered to Wickham on the condition that he take orders and enter the church. He refused. He demanded money instead. £3,000, which my cousin gave him, far more than the living was worth. Wickham gambled it away within 3 years and then had the audacity to return, demanding more."
"That cannot be true."
Lydia's voice lacked conviction. "It is true," Miss Darcy said. She stepped forward, her young face grave. "Mr. Wickham is a confirmed liar, Miss Lydia. He loves nothing more than to trick impressionable young girls into believing his tales of woe." Lydia's face drained white.
"But he was so sincere, so charming. He said—"
"What else did you tell him? What else did you do?" Mr. Bennet demanded. Lydia's defiance shattered completely. Her voice dropped to a whisper.
"He asked why Mr. Darcy was spending so much time at Longbourn. I told him it was just Lizzie learning to ride an old horse from his stables. He wanted to know which horse. I said Atlas, and he told me how much he loved that horse."
She pressed her hands to her face.
"I thought I was being fair, helping to correct a wrong. Mr. Wickham promised to repay my kindness some day, so I brought Mr. Wickham and Captain Denny to the stable. Captain Denny put the rope on Atlas. When we came out of the stables, Mr. Wickham had already departed."
"Oh, Lydia," Jane said in defeat.
"I did not know he was stealing."
Lydia's voice broke.
"When Captain Denny asked if Mr. Wickham was sure the horse belonged to him, Mr. Wickham swore it to be true. I do not know what I thought. That he loved the horse. That he would speak to Mr. Darcy, perhaps, come to some arrangement. Not steal him like a common thief."
"You stupid girl," Mrs. Bennet said, her voice thick with horror. "What have you done?" Lydia sobbed. Mr. Bennet stood before his youngest daughter, his expression a mixture of disappointment and weary resignation. "You met strangers in the evening alone, away from the protection of your home, daughter. You heard a charming man tell you a story that convinced you of your own importance, that transformed you into a champion of justice, and you never stopped to think whether it might be a lie. You failed to consider the consequences of your actions."
"Forgive me," Lydia wept. "Forgive me, I pray you. I did not mean for this to happen."
"But it has happened." Their father turned to Mr. Darcy. "I do not know how to express my regret adequately, sir. My daughter's actions, however well-intentioned she believed them to be, have enabled this theft. If there is anything I can do." Mr. Darcy nodded, his tone softening. Miss Lydia, I understand your desire for justice to be served. With that said, please share every detail, no matter how small. It may help us find Atlas."
"And Wickham."
The Colonel's expression was fearsome. While Lydia recounted the conversation through her tears, Elizabeth's anguish coursed through her. "There is more you should know," Mr. Darcy said, when Lydia had finished. His gaze found Elizabeth's. "Atlas hates Wickham, violently. When Wickham was young, before my father discovered his true nature, he was allowed free run of Pemberley. He often treated the horses poorly, used the whip excessively, rode them too hard, neglected their care. Atlas remembers. On the few occasions Wickham tried to ride him in later years, Atlas refused. Threw him once, nearly trampled him another time. This is why he did not come to the stable. Had Atlas seen him, he would have revolted."
"Atlas is in danger," Elizabeth said, her voice shaking.
"Wickham uses animals like he abuses people, then discards them when they no longer serve his purpose." Mr. Darcy's expression was stern. "We must find them, quickly." "I shall send for Colonel Forster and see if we can find Captain Denny," Colonel Fitzwilliam said, already moving toward his horse. "We will need every available man." Mr. Darcy approached Lydia. "Which direction did Captain Denny take?"
"Towards Lucas Lodge, I think. Once I realised Mr. Wickham was not waiting for me outside the stable, I had no reason to pay attention, and it was dark."
"Miss Lydia," said Mr. Darcy, "had Wickham not used your kindness, he would have found someone else, I have no doubt."
Lydia's whimpers faded, and the men's urgent planning became a distant hum. Everything narrowed to a single screaming thought. Atlas is gone. Elizabeth pressed her hands against her skirts to still them, but the trembling spread up her arms to her shoulders, through her entire body, until she thought she might shatter. Rage burned in her chest, hot and acidic. Each inhale felt sharp, inadequate, as though her lungs had forgotten how to work. Atlas was out there with Mr. Wickham, a man who had beaten horses, who cared not for their suffering, who would use Atlas until the old horse was broken or dead. The image of Atlas, steady, gentle Atlas, in pain, made Elizabeth's vision blur. She pressed a hand to her mouth, fighting nausea. The horse was tied to Mr. Darcy's early memories. This had to be heartbreaking for him. "Please." The prayer rose unbidden. "Please let them find him. Please let him be safe. Please." Within the hour, Longbourn's stable yard was crowded with horses and riders. Colonel Forster had arrived with a dozen militia officers, his face grave, as he confirmed that Wickham had been reassigned to a militia stationed in Newcastle, that he deserted instead.
"He planned this," Mr. Darcy said. "Where is Captain Denny?"
Colonel Forster sneered. "As soon as we heard the report that the animal was stolen, the captain admitted to believing the lieutenant's lies. Denny said he returned to the barracks once Wickham had possession of the horse. He is locked up. 2 soldiers are on watch. We will deal with him after we find your horse."
Sir William Lucas arrived with his 2 eldest sons, all mounted and prepared to help. The only person not seated on a horse was her father, who watched the preparations with an expression of profound frustration.
"I should be riding with them," he said to Elizabeth. "This happened on my property because of my daughter's foolishness and my failure as a father. And I cannot help because I never saw fit to purchase proper riding horses after you girls were grown."
Elizabeth had never heard such bitterness in her father's voice. He retreated with Mary and Kitty to the house. The search party divided into groups. Some would search toward Meryton, others toward Lucas Lodge, and still others along the main roads. Jacob insisted on joining, taking one of the plough horses that could at least manage a steady trot. Sam rode Miss Darcy's horse alongside Colonel Fitzwilliam. Mr. Darcy approached Elizabeth before mounting Gracie.
"We will find him,"
he said, his voice low and intense.
"I swear to you, we will return Atlas to you."
"Please be careful," she cried. "Both of you, Just be careful." Something flickered in Mr. Darcy's eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or tenderness.
"Consider it done, madam."
Then they were gone, rushing out of the stable yard in multiple directions, leaving Elizabeth standing with her mother, sisters, and Miss Darcy. Lydia wept. "My apologies, Mrs. Bennet," Miss Darcy said. "If I had realised that your family was acquainted with Mr. Wickham, I should have let you know the sort of man he is." "You bear no fault," Elizabeth said. "The fault lies with the man who told the lies, and the girl who believed them." Lydia's cries intensified as Miss Darcy stepped back, the colour draining from her face. Jane put her arm around their youngest sister. "Come inside, Lydia. You are not needed here." "I've ruined everything," Lydia wept. "Lizzie will never forgive me. Mr. Darcy will never forgive me. Atlas might be hurt because of me." Elizabeth wanted to say something comforting, but the words would not come. Instead, she turned to Atlas's empty stall and pressed her hand against the door. When Miss Darcy joined her, Elizabeth wrapped her arms around the girl's shoulders, pulling her close. "Please be safe," she prayed. "Please, please be safe." Miss Darcy pulled away. "Miss Elizabeth, there is something I need to tell you about George Wickham and me." They searched for hours. Mr. Darcy rode with Richard and Colonel Forster's group, pushing Gracie hard across the countryside, checking every barn, every abandoned cottage, every place a man might hide with a stolen horse. The autumn sun climbed higher, then began its descent toward the western horizon. Still no sign of Atlas. His mind raced with terrible possibilities. Wickham was desperate. Desperate men do desperate things. Atlas would fight him and would refuse to be controlled. Would Wickham hurt him before he requested a ransom? Darcy's stomach knotted with fear. Wickham. George Wickham damaged everything he touched. But not this time, not Atlas. Darcy would find them if he had to search every inch of Hertfordshire. Atlas deserved better than this. And Elizabeth. He must bring Atlas home to her. When had she become so important to him? When had her happiness become more vital to him than his own? He knew the answer, though he had not allowed himself to acknowledge it until now. He loved her intelligence, her wit, her passion for life, loved how she had looked at Atlas with such longing and joy, loved her kindness to Georgiana, her tolerance of his reserve, her refusal to be impressed by his wealth or intimidated by his rank. He loved Elizabeth Bennet. And if he failed to... There! Sam's shout cut through his thoughts. "Sir, I hear something." They all pulled up their horses, listening. At first Darcy heard only the wind in the trees, the stamping of their own mounts. Then it came, a sound that made his blood run cold. Not a whinny or a neigh, but a scream of fear. Atlas. There! Darcy kicked Gracie into a gallop, the others close behind. They crashed through a copse of trees and emerged into a clearing. Before them stood an abandoned cottage, half fallen into disrepair, its door hanging open. Behind the building, the corner of a small paddock was visible. They heard the unmistakable sounds of a struggle, a horse snorting, hooves striking wood, the crack of a whip, a man's cursing. Darcy leapt from Gracie and rounded the corner of the cottage. The horse was pressed against the far fence, his coat dark with sweat, his eyes rolling white with fury. Between Atlas and the railing stood George Wickham, whip in hand, his face twisted with rage. Even from this distance, Darcy could see the welts marking Atlas's shoulders, could see him flinch when Wickham raised the whip again. "No!" The word tore from Darcy's throat as he ran forward. Wickham's head snapped around. Then Wickham's expression hardened into something uglier and more vicious. He raised the whip high and brought it down with all his strength. Atlas reared up on his back hooves. Chapter 12. The move spurred every man in the clearing into action. Darcy vaulted the paddock fence. Richard was right behind him, moving with a soldier's deadly efficiency.
Colonel Forster shouted orders to his men, spreading them around the perimeter to cut off any escape. Wickham spun to face them, the whip still clutched in his hand. His face was flushed, his coat torn, and there was a wildness in his eyes that spoke of a man who knew he was cornered. "Stay back!" Wickham raised the whip, threateningly. "I will hurt him, Darcy. I swear I will." "Put down the whip," Darcy said, his voice deadly calm, despite the fury coursing through him. "Now." "Not until we have an understanding." Wickham sneered as he pulled a knife from his belt. "You're going to give me money, a great deal of it, or this horse dies." "How much?" Darcy asked, his eyes never leaving Wickham's face. £2,000. "Gambling debts?" Richard demanded. "To the wrong people." Wickham's voice cracked. "People who don't wait for payment. If I don't have the money by week's end, I'm a dead man." His laugh turned wild. "If you won't give me what I need, Darcy, I'll kill this horse and make you watch." "You do not want to do that," Darcy said, still advancing. "Whatever trouble you are in, killing Atlas will not save you." "Won't it?" Wickham raised the knife high. Before he could bring it down, Atlas moved. The horse was 25 years old, his joints stiff, his prime long past. But there was nothing old or slow about the way he lunged forward, ears pinned flat, teeth bared. Wickham stumbled backward with a cry of alarm, and Atlas pursued him with single-minded fury. "Atlas, no!" Darcy shouted. But the horse was beyond hearing. Years of remembered abuse coalesced into this moment of defiance. Atlas reared, his front hooves slashing the air. Wickham raised his arms to protect his face, and stumbled. His feet tangled, and he fell hard onto the packed earth. The horse's hooves came down. Wickham screamed and rolled, but not fast enough. One hoof grazed across the face with a sickening crunch. Blood sprayed across the dirt. "Get the horse!" Colonel Forster ordered his men. "Carefully, do not hurt him." But Atlas had already stopped. He stood over Wickham's prone form, nostrils flaring, muscles quivering with spent fury. Darcy moved toward Atlas, his hands raised, his voice low and soothing. "Easy, boy, easy. You have won." Atlas's ears swiveled toward Darcy's voice. The horse's chest heaved with exertion, sweat darkening his coat. Terrible welts marked his shoulders and flanks, where the whip had struck. A gash dripped blood across his chest, where Wickham's knife had found its mark. "Atlas," Darcy said, moving closer. "It is over. You are safe now. He will not hurt you again, I promise." Slowly, Atlas's rigid stance eased. His ears came forward. He turned his head toward Darcy, and in his dark eyes was a mixture of rage, pain, and a glimmer of trust. Darcy reached for the trailing lead rope. His fingers closed around it, and the tension drained from the horse's shoulders. "Good boy," he whispered. "Such a good, brave lad." Behind him, Richard hauled Wickham to his feet. Blood poured from Wickham's shattered nose. When he opened his mouth to protest, his front teeth were gone, broken off by the force of Atlas's hoof. Wickham's voice was thick, wet, barely intelligible. "Shut your mouth," Richard said coldly, "or what is left of it." 2 militia officers moved in to flank the prisoner. Wickham swayed between them, blood streaming down his ruined face. And Darcy understood that his greatest weapon, that charming smile, those handsome features, was destroyed forever. "Wickham," Colonel Forster barked, his voice cold with contempt. "Theft, cruelty to animals, assault. Take your pick. You will face a court-martial at the very least. More likely you will hang. You have no one to blame but yourself." To his men he said, "Take the prisoner to camp and guard him well. He not only has no future in the militia, he has no future at all." Darcy continued his examination of Atlas, his hands gentle but thorough.
The welts were painful but superficial, raised and angry, but not deep enough to scar. Atlas flinched when Darcy's fingers found a bloody spot on his foreleg, but he stood still, his trust in Darcy evident. It was when Darcy moved to check Atlas's chest that he found it. Blood, running down his chest, matting the hair. Darcy's stomach clenched. He parted the hair carefully and found the wound, a gash perhaps 3 inches long.
"Richard,"
he called, his voice raw.
"I need cloth."
Richard was there in an instant, already loosening his cravat, as Darcy was doing the same with his own.
"How bad?" "Deep enough. It needs binding."
Darcy accepted the cravat and pressed both cloths firmly against the wound. Atlas shifted but did not pull away. If they could get the horse to Longbourn, if they could keep infection at bay.
"We need to move him," Darcy said. "The wound needs proper cleaning and binding, and Atlas needs water, rest and care."
"Can he walk?" Richard asked.
"I do not know."
Darcy ran his hand down Atlas's legs, checking for heat, swelling or any sign of injury beyond the visible wounds. Everything seemed sound.
"Atlas, can you walk? Can you make it home?"
Atlas's ears swiveled toward him. The horse took a tentative step, then another. He limped, favouring his left foreleg, but he could move.
"Sam,"
Darcy called,
"bring Gracie. I will lead Atlas on foot. It will be slower, but I will not risk riding him in this condition."
"Aye, sir."
Sam vaulted the fence and brought Gracie forward, her reins loose in his hand.
2 miles back to Longbourn, Richard said. "Maybe a bit more. Can he make it?"
"He will make it," Darcy said,
his voice carrying absolute conviction.
"Atlas has never failed me. He will not fail now."
"She will forgive you, you know,"
Richard said eventually.
"Who?"
"Miss Elizabeth."
"I do not deserve her forgiveness."
Darcy's voice was rough.
"I brought Atlas here to teach her to ride. Instead, I have caused him to be beaten by a man who should never have been allowed within 10 miles of him."
"You could not have known Wickham would do this."
"Could I not? I have known Wickham all my life. I knew what he was capable of. And still, I was careless. I worried only about Georgiana and Elizabeth. I allowed my guard to drop."
Darcy's hand gripped the lead rope.
"Atlas has paid the price for my complacency."
"And Wickham will pay the price for his cruelty," Richard said.
They crested a slight rise, and Longbourn came into view. The figures in the stable yard all turned toward the lane, watching, waiting.
"Almost there, boy," he said.
Atlas's ears swiveled toward his voice. The horse's steps quickened slightly, as though he too could sense they were nearing safety. The moment Elizabeth saw Atlas, her entire body sagged with relief. Then she ran. "Elizabeth, wait!" Miss Bennet called. But Elizabeth was already halfway down the lane, her skirts flying, heedless of propriety or decorum, or anything except the horse, limping toward her. She reached them, breathless. "Oh, Atlas," she said, her voice breaking. "Oh, you brave, wonderful horse." She reached up to touch his face with trembling fingers, and Atlas lowered his head to her, huffing warm breath against her palm. Tears streamed down Elizabeth's face, but she smiled. "You found him," she said, looking at Darcy with such gratitude that tenderness welled up inside him. Thank you for bringing him home."
"He found himself," Darcy said. "I merely brought him to you."
They walked the final distance together, Darcy on one side of Atlas, Elizabeth on the other, her hand resting gently on the horse's neck. The gathered crowd parted to let them pass, and Darcy led Atlas into the stable, into his box, where fresh hay and water waited. Jacob was there immediately. Sam brought a lamp and hung it on the hook so they could see properly. Darcy carefully removed the blood-soaked cravats and examined the area in better light.
"It is a clean cut,"
he said, relief evident in his voice.
"Not too deep. If we keep it clean, prevent infection,
"We will," Elizabeth said. She had rolled up her sleeves and accepted a cloth from Jacob, dipping it in the water. "Tell me what to do." They worked in silence for a while, cleaning the wound, checking Atlas's other injuries. The welts from the whip were angry and raised, but none had broken the skin. They would heal with time and care.
"Sam," Darcy said, "ride to Netherfield and fetch my medical supplies from my valet. There is a salve in my trunk. Bring the entire kit."
"Aye, sir."
Sam rushed to Gracie.
"He needs water," Darcy stated, "and food if he will take it."
Jacob brought fresh water, and Atlas drank long and deep. They offered him grain, but he only lipped at it half-heartedly before turning away.
"That is not uncommon,"
Darcy assured Elizabeth, seeing her concern.
"He is exhausted and in pain. His appetite will return once he has rested."
Mr. Bennet appeared in the stable doorway.
"How is he?"
"He will live if we can prevent infection," Darcy said, "but he needs care, constant attention for the next few days at least."
"Then he shall have it."
Mr. Bennet's gaze moved to his daughter, who stood with her hand resting on Atlas's neck, her eyes never leaving the horse.
"Lizzie will not leave his side, I suspect, and I imagine you will not either, Mr. Darcy."
"No," Darcy said, "I will not."
"Then I shall ask Hill to prepare the guest rooms for you and your sister. You cannot ride back and forth to Netherfield in the middle of the night if Atlas takes a turn."
Mr. Bennet's expression was serious.
"My youngest daughter may have been foolish, but you have been honourable in this matter. The least I can do is offer you hospitality while you tend your horse."
"Thank you, sir."
Mr. Bennet nodded and withdrew, leaving Darcy and Elizabeth with Atlas, and the soft glow of lamplight. Richard extended his thanks to the others for their help, while Miss Bennet invited them all inside Longbourn for a refreshment. Elizabeth turned to look at him, and in the lamplight he saw tear tracks on her cheeks and the depth of emotion in her eyes. "You saved him," she said.
"He saved himself, Elizabeth. You should have seen him. He faced down Wickham with more courage than most men could muster. He is old, he is hurt, but he is unbroken. That is what matters."
Elizabeth's eyes searched his face, and Darcy knew she was seeing past his words to the truth beneath. He loved this horse. He loved watching Elizabeth with this horse. He cleared his throat.
"We should recheck him,"
he said, stepping away before he could say something he could not take back.
"Make certain the bleeding has fully stopped."
They fell into a routine over the next few hours, tending the wound, offering water, monitoring Atlas's breathing, and the warmth of his skin. Sam returned with the medical supplies, and Darcy applied the salve carefully to both the chest wound and the worst of the whip marks. Night fell, and the household quieted. And still they, along with the grooms, remained in the stable, keeping watch over Atlas as he dozed fitfully in his box, his weight shifting constantly as he stood, his head hanging low. At some point Elizabeth's head drooped onto Darcy's shoulder. He stilled, barely breathing, not daring to disturb her. She was exhausted, he realised, emotionally and physically spent.
"Sleep," he murmured. "I will wake you if anything changes, I promise."
She was asleep before she could protest again, her weight warm and trusting against his side. Darcy allowed himself the luxury of looking at her, really looking at her, without her bright eyes watching him. The curve of her cheek, the dark lashes against her skin, the small furrow between her brows that suggested she worried even in sleep. He loved her. The realization was not new. He had admitted it to himself during the search for Atlas. But here, in the quiet darkness of the stable, with Elizabeth sleeping and Atlas breathing steadily in his box, the truth of it soaked into his bones. He would forever be in love with Elizabeth Bennet. Chapter 13. Sam entered Atlas's stall with fresh hay, speaking quietly to the horse. Elizabeth should have been embarrassed to be so close to Mr. Darcy, but she was not. Instead, she appreciated his kindness. "How is he?" She sat up. Her neck ached from the awkward position, but concern for Atlas pushed the discomfort aside.
"I need to check the wound again."
Mr. Darcy's voice was rough with fatigue. He moved to the box, lamp in hand, and Elizabeth followed. Atlas stood with his head lowered, his breathing steady. Mr. Darcy carefully peeled away the bandage, examining the area in the lamplight.
"Still clean," he said with relief. "No fresh bleeding."
"Oh, that is good." The three took turns throughout the night checking the wounds. At dawn, Sam examined the horse and found no further bleeding.
"The crisis may be over,"
Mr. Darcy said, as they stood together as the sun rose.
"If we can keep infection at bay for another day or two."
"Then he will heal," Elizabeth finished. She wanted to believe it, needed to believe it. Once Colonel Fitzwilliam and Miss Darcy arrived to provide aid, and Longbourn's housekeeper brought a tray for Mr. Darcy and Sam, Elizabeth was persuaded to go into her house. Jane met her at the door with tea, and a gentle scolding about the necessity of caring for herself, as well as the horse. "You look exhausted, Lizzie." "I'm well enough." Elizabeth accepted the tea gratefully. Jane grew concerned. "Mr. Darcy looks worse than you do. He will make himself ill if he continues." "I know, but I cannot convince him to leave Atlas's side for more than a few moments." Elizabeth set down her teacup. "Jane, he loves that horse as much as I do, perhaps more. The thought of losing him—" "Then you must help him save Atlas," Jane said simply. "Both of you together. You are stronger together than either of you could be alone." Elizabeth thought of the long night, the shared vigil, how they had worked together without needing words. "I will do as you suggest," she said. "Atlas will need fresh bandages soon." After resting, Elizabeth returned to the stable to find Mr. Darcy and Sam examining Atlas. Their furrowed brows made her stomach clench. "What is wrong?"
"He is too warm."
Mr. Darcy's hand rested on Atlas's neck.
"And look at the wound."
Elizabeth moved closer. The edges of the wound, which had been cleaned that morning, showed the faintest hint of redness. "Infection?"
"Perhaps. It is early yet. We caught it quickly."
But Mr. Darcy's voice held a tension that belied his calm words.
"We need to clean it again."
"Tell me what to do." They spent the next hour carefully washing the affected area with water that cook had boiled and cooled to a bearable temperature. Mr. Darcy applied more salve with meticulous care, while Elizabeth held Atlas steady, murmuring reassurances to the horse.
"There,"
Mr. Darcy said finally.
"That is all we can do for now. We watch him, keep the perimeter clean, pray the infection does not spread."
But by evening Atlas stood with his head hanging lower, his eyes dull, his breathing laboured. The redness surrounding the injury had spread, and despite their best efforts, a thin line of pus had begun to seep from the edges. "No," Elizabeth said, pressing her hand to Atlas's chest. "No, this cannot be happening." Sam's face was dour.
"We need to lance the wound, sir. Drain the infection before it spreads further. It will be painful for him, and there is no guarantee. There is no guarantee it will work."
Mr. Darcy's voice broke slightly.
"But we must try."
"Yes, we must try," Elizabeth said. Mr. Darcy and Sam worked by lamplight, their hands steady despite the strain evident in every line of the men's bodies. Elizabeth held Atlas's head, spoke to him constantly, and tried not to flinch when the horse's muscles tensed with pain. When it was done, the wound drained, cleaned and dressed with fresh bandages, Mr. Darcy and Sam stood, trembling from exhaustion and fear. "Will he survive this?" Elizabeth asked hesitantly.
"I do not know."
Mr. Darcy's honesty was painful, but appreciated.
"Infection is unpredictable. Sometimes a horse fights it off. Rarely."
He stopped, unable to finish.
"And we will fight you with him," Sam said. "We will not give up. No."
Mr. Darcy agreed, his eyes meeting hers.
"We will not."
The days that followed tested Elizabeth as she had never imagined. Atlas grew weaker, his legs swaying when he stood, his head hanging low. They drained it twice more, hoping it would be the last, watching with dread as the infection persisted. Elizabeth cried more than once, pressing her face against Atlas's neck and begging him not to give up. Each time Mr. Darcy was there, steady, calm, refusing to allow her to spiral into despair.
"He is still drinking," he would point out. "That is significant. Horses who have given up refuse water. Atlas is still fighting."
Miss Darcy spoke from behind them. "How much can he endure?"
"More than I think, probably,"
Mr. Darcy said, his hand comforting on Elizabeth's shoulder. She desperately wanted to lean into him. Instead, she took the tea tray from his sister's hand. Mr. Darcy reassured them.
"I know you are both frightened. I am frightened too. But we cannot let Atlas see our fear. He needs to know we believe in him."
So Elizabeth tried to be strong when she felt like breaking, tried to believe when doubt crept in during the long night hours. And through it all, Mr. Darcy remained her anchor, checking the wound with methodical care, adjusting treatments based on Atlas's response, explaining everything. Hence, she understood what was happening and why. On the third day, Mr. Darcy waited until his sister returned to the house, then took Elizabeth aside, his expression grave. Not a few minutes prior, Atlas laid down, no longer strong enough to stand.
"Elizabeth, we need to discuss something difficult."
Her stomach dropped. "What is it?"
"Atlas is in pain, considerable pain, though he bears it with his usual stoicism. And the infection, despite all our efforts, is not improving as quickly as I had hoped."
He chose his words carefully.
"There may come a time, I pray we do not reach it, but there may come a time when the kindest thing we can do for him is to end his suffering."
"No." The word came out fierce, immediate.
"I do not say this lightly."
Mr. Darcy's voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed his pain.
"But I love him too much to let him suffer needlessly. When a horse can no longer stand, can no longer drink, when the pain becomes too great, Elizabeth, continuing to fight at that point is not love. It is selfishness."
Tears streamed down her face. "But he is still drinking."
"Yes, and as long as he continues, we continue to fight. I'm not suggesting we are at that point now. I am simply—"
He drew a breath.
"I am simply asking you to understand that if Atlas tells us he is ready to stop fighting, we must listen, even though it will break our hearts."
"I cannot." Her voice broke. "I cannot lose him. Not now. Not when I have only just—" Mr. Darcy pulled her into his arms, his embrace solid and sure.
"I do not want to lose him either, but our wants do not matter as much as his welfare."
He stroked her hair gently. Elizabeth pressed her face against his coat and cried, for Atlas, for the unfairness of it all, for the fear that had been building for days. And Mr. Darcy held her, his strength unwavering, his presence the only thing keeping her from falling apart completely. "Forgive me," she said finally, pulling away and wiping her eyes. "I should be stronger. You need—"
"I need you exactly as you are."
His hand cupped her cheek. "Thank you," she said.
"For what?"
"For staying calm when I cannot. For loving Atlas enough to make the hard choices if they become necessary, but not before." She managed a weak smile. "For being exactly who you are, Fitzwilliam Darcy." His eyes widened slightly at her use of his Christian name. A sound from Atlas's box made them both turn. The horse whinnied. Mr. Darcy was there in an instant, his hands steadying, his voice calm and reassuring.
"Easy, boy, easy. We have you."
Atlas stabilised, but the incident left Elizabeth shaken. He was so weak, so very weak.
"He needs water," Mr. Darcy said, "but he has been refusing it for the past few hours. Elizabeth, bring the bucket. Let us try together."
They spent the next hour coaxing, pleading, trying every trick Mr. Darcy knew to get Atlas to drink. The horse turned his head away from the bucket, from the water mixed with honey, even from the grain mash that had always been his favourite. Finally, as the sun began to set on the fourth day, Elizabeth pressed her face against Atlas's neck and whispered, "Please, please do not give up. I know you are tired. I know you hurt. But please keep fighting. Just a little longer. Please." Mr. Darcy stood at the box door, his face carved from stone, watching, assessing, preparing himself for the conversation he had warned her about. She turned to face him, tears streaming down her cheeks. "One more day, please. Just give him one more day." He was silent for a long moment, his eyes moving between Elizabeth and Atlas. She saw the war in his expression, his love for the horse, battling with his compassion for a creature in pain, his desire to honour her request, balanced against his responsibility to make the hard choices.
"One more day,"
he said finally, quietly.
"But Elizabeth, you must prepare yourself. If he does not improve by tomorrow morning, if he still refuses water, if the fever does not break, I will make a decision, for his sake."
"I know." She barely got the words out. "I know." Mr. Darcy moved to stand beside her. They stood together in the lamplight, drawing strength from each other as Atlas struggled. Elizabeth had never felt more helpless in her life.
"You should rest," Mr. Darcy said after a while. "Go inside. Sleep. I will watch him tonight."
"I cannot leave him."
"You can and you will. You will be no good to Atlas if you collapse. Send my sister to me if she is not already asleep."
His tone was gentle but implacable.
"If anything changes, you will know, I promise."
She wanted to argue, but she was so tired, so unbelievably tired. And the steady confidence in Mr. Darcy's voice made her believe he truly would manage through the night. "You will wake me if—"
"I will wake you if there is a significant change, good or bad."
He guided her toward the stable door.
"Now go. Let your sister feed you and put you to bed. I need you strong tomorrow."
Once inside the house, Elizabeth found Miss Darcy slumbering in the guest room. Waking her, Elizabeth entered her chamber and fell across the bed, asleep before her head hit the pillow. She woke to the hall clock chiming once. Dressing quickly, she hurried to the stables. Inside, she found Mr. Darcy slumped against the stall wall, his eyes closed, his hand still resting on Atlas's leg, as though even in exhaustion he could not break contact. Elizabeth knelt beside him, her hand covering his. "Fitzwilliam?" His eyes opened immediately.
"Elizabeth, is something wrong?"
"You need rest, real rest." Her thumb traced across his knuckles. "Let me watch him for a while."
"I'm well enough."
"You are not." Her free hand touched his face, the chill of exhaustion in his skin. "Please, you do not have to carry this alone." Something in his expression cracked. He turned his hand beneath hers, interlacing their fingers.
"Stay with me?"
"Yes." She sat beside him against the wall, and his arm came around her shoulders, drawing her close. Her head found the hollow of his shoulder, as naturally as breathing. They sat in silence, hands clasped, listening to Atlas's steady breathing. "Whatever happens tomorrow," Elizabeth said, "we face it together." He pulled her closer.
"Together." "Elizabeth, wake up."
Darcy shook her shoulder.
"Look."
Atlas swivelled his ears toward them as his head lifted. After a few tries, he eventually got to his feet, and he drank. Not the listless, half-hearted lipping they had been trying to coax for days. Determined drinking, long, steady pulls that spoke of genuine thirst. His head was still low, his movements slow, but he was drinking. "He is going to live," she said with wonder.
"Yes."
Mr. Darcy's hand found her shoulder.
"Yes, he is going to live."
Elizabeth turned and threw her arms around his waist, sobbing with relief. "You saved him. You did this. Your knowledge, your calm, your refusal to panic."
"We saved him,"
Mr. Darcy corrected, as he pulled her into his embrace.
"I could not have done this without you and Sam, Elizabeth. I would not have wanted to."
She pulled away, studying his face. Days of stubble covered his jaw, exhaustion he had hidden so well darkened his eyes, and relief that was almost painful in its intensity. "Fitzwilliam," she raised her hands to his face. "Thank you."
"I did not do it only for Atlas,"
he said. His eyes searched hers, more vulnerable and open than she had ever seen them.
"I did it for you, because I love you, Elizabeth Bennet. I fell in love with you as you learnt to ride, but I fell deeper in love with you as you refused to give up hope, even when hope seemed foolish."
Elizabeth's heart skipped. "Fitzwilliam—"
"Let me finish, please."
He drew a shaky breath.
"I am proud, reserved, and uncomfortable in society. I often give offence without meaning to. My connections are excellent, but my temperament is not. You could do far better than—"
"Stop! You are wrong about all of it. You are not proud. You are protective of those you love. You are not uncomfortable in society. You are selective about whose opinion matters. You speak with honesty rather than flattery, and I have never valued anything more. And as for doing better—" Her voice gentled. "There is no one better than you, Fitzwilliam Darcy. You are good and kind and honourable. You stayed by this horse's side for days without proper sleep, because you could not bear to leave him. You held me when I cried, and kept me steady when I wanted to collapse. You made the difficult choices, and bore the burden of them, so I would not have to. I love you, desperately and completely, and with my whole heart."
"Elizabeth."
Her name was a prayer on his lips.
"I do not deserve you."
"Then we are matched in our unworthiness. I do not deserve a man who would bring a 25-year-old horse from London, simply because I mentioned wanting to ride." She smiled through her tears. "I think we shall simply have to spend the rest of our lives trying to deserve each other."
"Is that a yes?"
His voice was unsteady, hopeful. "Are you asking?"
"Miss Elizabeth Bennet."
He straightened despite his exhaustion, despite the hay in his hair and the wrinkled state of his clothes.
"Would you do me the great honour of becoming my wife?"
"Yes." The word came without hesitation. "Yes, I will marry you. I will love you for the rest of my life, and I will spend every day thanking God that you brought Atlas to Hertfordshire, and in doing so brought yourself into my life." He kissed her then, there in the stable, with Atlas as their witness. A soft huff from the box made them break apart. Atlas had finished drinking, and watched them, with what Elizabeth could have sworn was approval in his dark eyes. "I think he is pleased," she said.
"Of course he is pleased."
Darcy ran his hand down Atlas's neck with infinite gentleness.
"Thank you, old friend. You brought me the woman I love. I will be forever in your debt."
Atlas leaned into his touch, then reached his head toward Elizabeth. She stroked his soft nose, marvelling at the life in his eyes. They stood close as Atlas dozed peacefully. Elizabeth knew that horses had claimed a corner of her heart at 5 years old, but Fitzwilliam Darcy had filled it completely. Epilogue. 2 years later, Elizabeth Darcy stood in the shade of the stable as her husband crossed the paddock, with their son cradled against his chest. Bennet Fitzwilliam Darcy, 8 weeks old, blinked against the spring sunshine as his father approached the horse grazing peacefully near the fence.
"Atlas," Darcy called softly. "Come meet someone."
The old gelding raised his head, his movements slower, but his eyes still bright. He walked toward them with the dignity that had defined his long life. The horse lowered his head to investigate the bundle in Darcy's arms.
"This is my son,"
her husband said, his voice thick with emotion.
"And when he is old enough, you will teach him to ride, just as you taught me, Georgiana, and his mother. Will you do that for us, old friend?"
Atlas snuffled softly against the baby's dark hair, and Elizabeth pressed her hand to her heart at the gentleness of it. Darcy turned toward her.
"Elizabeth, will you help me?"
She crossed the paddock quickly. Her husband handed their son to her. Then he swung onto Atlas with effortless grace, settling into the saddle before reaching down.
"On my honour,"
he said, his eyes meeting hers.
"Our son's first ride."
Elizabeth lifted Bennet carefully, placing him in his father's waiting arms. Darcy cradled the baby against him, one arm secure around the small body, the other hand resting on Atlas's neck.
"Walk on."
He clicked his tongue. Atlas moved forward with sure steps, as though he understood the precious cargo his rider carried. They made a slow circuit of the paddock, man, baby, and horse, while Elizabeth's tears streamed down her face. When they returned to her, Darcy's eyes were bright with unshed tears. He handed Bennet to Elizabeth, then dismounted and pulled them both into his embrace.
"Thank you,"
he whispered against her hair, as Sam removed the bridle and saddle, leading Atlas out to the pasture. Elizabeth had been 5 years old the first time she fell in love. Then Fitzwilliam, proud, reserved, impossibly generous Fitzwilliam, saw what she hoped before she could ask for it. Atlas had carried her husband from boy to man, and had taken her from longing into joy, and soon enough he would carry their son. The circle was complete. In the pasture, Atlas lifted his head and whinnied. Elizabeth smiled. She had been right all along. Some dreams were worth waiting for. The end. This has been Hearts and Horses, a Pride and Prejudice novella, written by Christy Capps, narrated by Stevie Zimmerman. Copyright 2026 by Joy D. King. Production copyright by Joy D. King.